we know things are busy in Annapolis, so I'm not sure. Senator Washington, are you out there? Okay. Delegate Bond Stewart? Okay. Secretary Flora, I'll just repeat again. I do have to leave at 11:30 to get to Annapolis for a hearing. Joe will just go ahead and finish the meeting after that, and we'll just keep things rolling. We're all covering a lot of bases these days. So next I see Theo, you are out there, the HCD. Lori with Mako. Lori's here. Thank you. And Amy is, I see Amy out there. Hi, Amy. You're here. Mako Rural. James Gaston is here. I see you settling in, James. James,
Man.
expected, what's this February? I expected,
Valentine's Day is past.
Oh, yeah.
Valentine's Day was Monday.
Okay.
Abe Lincoln topic.
I was wondering,
The day is already passed.
I count on these things. Okay. We'll think about March.
I thought about it.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of green for March.
Okay, we got you. Okay, Councilman Hoff, yes, you are here. First one in. Let me see, Dave Thaler, are you out there, Dave? Dave's usually with us. Maybe he'll be joining yet. Tiffany Harris. Tiffany? Okay. Chesapeake Region Community, Quinn Griffith. Out there? Nope. Okay, AIA, Deborah. You've got people coming in.
Coming in.
Did I miss anybody?
Mr. Thomas?
Yes.
Welcome.
Okay.
Next, wherever you like, I'll introduce you shortly.
Okay, Priscilla is here with ARP. Mandy just walked in. Yes, Mandy's here with interior designers. Jennifer. Yes, here you are. Thank you. Lisa. Lisa is now replacing Chelsea Heyman, who has changed her position and moved on to DHCD. So Lisa will be our rep there. And then we have aging Isabella is she with us. There you are, Isabella. Thank you. Okay, so I think we have everybody almost accounted for.
Sure.
If people join, Susan, somebody can probably tell if others come on just through the participant list, right? Oh, there's Quinn. Did I say he was here? Okay. I think we're good to go. We're going to jump in. For those of you that joined late, let me just say again that I am going to slip out the door at 11:30 to get over to Annapolis for a hearing that I have to be there for. The Housing Expansion Affordability Act. I have to testify on a panel. So we are going to keep things moving. If you, I think, mute your phones if you're online. I think I heard some background. And the other introduction we have is Fahmi. Can everybody see Fahmi? Wave, come over this way. Fahmi is our long-awaited intern from the University of Maryland Planning Program.
So I'm Fahmi. I'm in the community planning program in University of Maryland, and I'm working with the EDU task force on market analysis. So especially focusing on literature review right now. Okay, so hope to see you in the next few meetings.
Great. So now you know if you hear her or see her tracking you down, you'll know that that's.
Is this later? Is here for panel?
Yeah.
Yeah, come on in.
Come on in.
Oh, okay, all right.
All right, I'll stand over.
Okay, well, that is our first item on the agenda almost, right? Let's do the overview. So agenda, let's go over the agenda.
Okay.
Next up, you want to take it?
Yeah, so we're in the welcome and overview right now, starting around 10. Our panel members are here. We will have a panel discussion. I want to thank them. And I'll let them introduce themselves when we begin. Then we'll go on to looking at today's specific topic, which is parking and community facilities. As usually we have the day's topic later on in the agenda, but since Secretary Flora has to leave earlier, we are moving it up. Then we'll take some time to look at the draft design and building code recommendations that arose out of our discussion on the January 16th meeting. We'll briefly touch on the builder and developer survey results, which are also shared as part of this agenda item I shared with all of you last week, and we have a couple slides about it as well. I'm going to give a very brief legal update on some cases that they impact this topic. They're not in Maryland, but I did want to address them because they do inform our work and some of our deliberations. I will say that our counsel, Assistant AG Adam Snyder, has also been pulled into succession responsibilities today. So he does have some updates on some of the questions that have been posed specifically related to covenants that he will be addressing at the March meeting. So this is going to be my legal update of news stories related to certain cases, but we cannot be taking a lot of in-depth legal questions because I'm not a lawyer. So please save those for March. Well, as always, from 12 to 12:15, we'll have public comment and then our summary and final thoughts. So these are the objectives for today: to analyze, consider, and discuss the ADU development perspectives of HOAs and community associations. We have some of that as our panel discussion today. We will be getting to attend. Develop preliminary legislative and policy recommendations related to parking and community facilities requirements. Today's topic. Compile a list of best practices and practical issues for the same parking and community facilities requirements. As always, receive, review, and discuss public comment, and then describe and discuss recent ADU legal challenges. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have removed that. We're not going to be talking about Maryland law regarding restrictive covenants. We will be talking about the first because Adam, as I mentioned, Adam Snyder got pulled into session. So as a reminder to the audience, both in here and online, so I know we have a number of people online, we always accept public comments. We'll save the ones during the meeting for 12 to 12:15, but there's always the commenting form, which is available on our website that we compile for each meeting. We add on the new comments to it. I pull out comments related to that topic. I want to point out that now, we've come a long way. We've got 4 sets of preliminary recommendations related to various topic areas. And we are really encouraging public comment and also task force member comment on those preliminary recommendations. So the whole full set has been posted as part of today's agenda packet. And we really encourage some feedback on those recommendations. We got a lot of public comment generally on the topic of ADUs, the discussions that's happened during meetings, but we're at that stage now with the report due in June to start getting comments on the recommendations. All right.
Joe, I might just add, I hope that everyone's taken time to read through the comments. Some excellent comments in there. There's a lot. We're up to 30 pages now of documented comments, but it really does just show the diverse thinking and experiences and people's concerns in those comments. And I think it's really important that we all read them firsthand and go through those. So I just really want to thank anyone who's been providing those comments and listening in on these task force. We appreciate you. We hear you. And then thank the staff for continuing to compile those so that we have all of that information also. So thank you all.
So I wanted to take a few minutes to reflect on where we come from, where we're going, remind everybody, we meet once a month, but there's a lot of work happening in between meetings. We're making progress that you all contributed to. So we're past the halfway mark in our task force, in our tenure, right? We first met in September. This is our 6th meeting. It doesn't seem like that many, but in many ways it seems like more. But we are definitely have passed our halfway mark. We started our analysis and detailed deliberations during the November meeting. And that's also when we introduced the housing market analysis and meeting and research plan, all of which are linked on here, as well as our first zoning topic, the use and approval processes. So as Fahmi introduced herself, you don't have to say it. Okay. She's specifically going to be helping with the housing market analysis right now, focusing on the literature review, right? So what is out there from other states, from Maryland, nationwide about what have been the impacts of ADUs, what does the market say about ADUs, and what actual policies or market conditions actually lead to their construction or proliferation. So she's really helping us with that. Throughout our deliberation, we've been developing draft recommendations based on the topic area of each previous meeting. And they are linked here again. They were linked on the previous slide. They're also linked here. I also sent them to you all. Essentially, the recommendations are the heart of the final report. There'll be a lot of other things that I write and add to it about background research or methodology. But those are really the heart. We will continue to seek feedback on the most recently developed draft recommendations during each meeting. So later on today, we'll look back at the draft recommendations for our topic last time. But we're also seeking task force member feedback as well as public comments in between meetings. I will develop a document on the Microsoft Teams site specific to the task force members, which will make it easier for you to submit comments. Right now, it's a PDF that has a notes column that's probably hard. I mean, it's not as easy to get in there and make comments. So I'm gonna work on that this week into next to make a document that's easier to get task force comments on. Looking forward, we still have one focus group to complete in preparation for the 319 meeting, that's housing organizations. And then we're doing our second to last panel discussion, well, our last panel discussion, but we've done 4 panel discussions in our focus groups. We have one today with HOA community associations. Let's see. And also, please let me know if you recommend any housing organizations for that focus group. I'm a little behind on pulling that one together, focusing on the other ones. So we know housing organizations as well here at Maryland Department of Planning, but if any of you really want, or you recommend one, please send me that recommendation as well as a contact where you can connect me with. Our final scheduled topic, as outlined in the meeting research plan, is utilities, fees, and affordability. That's down here at March, from March 19th. Fahmi, will present her housing market analysis research during the April meeting. We will also review the results of the environmental organizations survey, which I will touch on later today. Also, during that April meeting, we're going to work with you all to prioritize and as needed, consolidate the preliminary recommendations for the final report. Right, so these are the ones that I've shared with you are really preliminary recommendations. We need to consolidate, we want to prioritize. A lot of them will be included perhaps in best practice at the end, but we really want to focus some key ones at the beginning of the document, beginning of the final report. These are our priority recommendations. So I want you, when you're going through and putting comments down on them and giving us feedback on them, I also want you to be thinking in your mind what you want to prioritize or how they can be consolidated. Because we believe that the report will have a greater impact, especially because not everybody, the audience we want to reach, there's a good chance they're not going to read the whole document. So we want to make sure that we have those priorities, the big hitter, the big ideas right at the beginning. And then in May, our last meeting, we will review the draft report and conduct our final deliberations. And as a reminder, our final report is due to the General Assembly and the Governor's Office on June 1st of this year.
So Joe, yeah, I just want to emphasize that April meeting is going to be very crucial because that's the point at which we really have to essentially start and reach some agreement. Because if we wait to the May meeting, it's going to be too late. Report's going to be due. So the May meeting is about the final tweaks, but we may have to see where we're at in April. We may have to decide we need more of a working session. We may have to adjust as needed, because I would say that April meeting is where we've really got to get it essentially to the finish line and then be able to write it up. You all will see it. Obviously, we can make tweaks out of what comes out of May, but really, we have 2 months, gang. And so things are moving pretty fast and we've tried to sort of keep it, bring it in. And
So
that's-
is your idea that potentially we need to be prepared that we could have a longer meeting? Like a break in between the lunch break and
I think that's a very real possibility, and I'm going to talk to the staff about that because I think, well, we've been trying to sort of repeat the recommendations after each, but they're preliminary. And I know you all know that that's based on segment. When you see the recommendations holistically, because we've been trying to sort of draft them as we go, we may need time to talk about that. And I want to make sure in working with the team that we come out of that April meeting pretty solid.
knowing what.
Yes. And then it's really, the staff team is going to have to, get it written, essentially produce it, package it. By May, we ought to be at a point where it's, hey, this looks great. Everything we said, here's some tweaks, here's some things we need to kind of take care of. But time to nail it in. So I just want to emphasize that. And, I'll be working with staff on this side to sort of make sure that these next 60 days are going to be pretty critical. So with that, Joe, I know you're ready to get the panel going, but anything else? Anybody has questions on this
Yeah,
part of
I
it?
did leave some room for discussion. this slide, that we've already said, what you all need from us to, over the next 2 months, to meet that objective that's stated here.
Okay,
Yes.
just, do you have a specific bent on housing organizations that you're looking for, or is that just a really general term?
I would say organizations that, advocate for housing, construct housing, nonprofits or other advocacy groups, that focus on housing. We do want a geographic, diversity. So not just ones that work in populated areas, something to work statewide.
Questions, other thoughts about the process? I hope everybody is on board with where we're trying to get to. We weren't given a lot of time, so. And sometimes, less can be more, because eventually you got to bring it to the finish line, right? So I think we will get there, but I would say if there was ever a time for you to say, oh, I've been going to get to that, I've been going to read that, I know it's there, this would be the time, these next 60 days, to make sure that you've kind of really dove in and read some of those resources and materials. So, yeah. And if you can't find anything, let us know. Any other questions?
Okay, well, we're a little bit early, but all the panel members are here. That's great. I guess I didn't.
Yeah, I'm going to switch
I didn't-
it out.
If we maybe sit over here, so you all could be on this.
I'm going to switch out.
Okay, all
Yeah,
right.
they should be here. Do we have name tags or?
No, I don't think that's.
Just
But
pretend,
have them all.
somebody pretend you're me. And I'm going to go over here because I think we want to make sure we can do everything. In fact, I may go around that side. So that we give full focus to the panel. And before we do that, I really want to thank you all for taking time and coming here today. And Joe will make the formal introductions, but it's really important. I really do appreciate you all being here and helping us with this very important issue. Thank you. I'm going to let you all take the seat.
For a little background, if you will recall, I think it was, pretty sure it was the October meeting. Our second meeting when we met at Windsor Mill. We went through our research plan and how we were going to engage stakeholders on this topic. And at that time, the task force shared the interest in hearing from planning directors, hearing from builders and developers, environmental organizations, HOA residents, might be forgetting one, but they also said we wanted to hear from community associations, neighborhood associations, and homeowners associations. So we've been going through that. Some of them we are submitting distributing surveys, like we'll talk about the builder developer survey later. We'll be submitting or distributing early next month an environmental organization survey, but the other ones we've been doing focus groups or panels. So today, we have the community associations, neighborhood associations, and HOAs. I think that our primary HOA representative got pulled into something else today. So I'm not sure if you all are from, I know you all are with community associations. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the inner workings of HOAs. If we get to those questions and, we can skip over them if they're a little bit too.
I can hear you.
heavy. Okay.
I've written them, I've done them, I've written them. I will lean in.
So Fami, could you move? We maybe get you all together. We can, the three of you, and I'll have you all introduce yourself here in a second. All right, and as a reminder that for each of the focus groups and panels, we have that certain questions that we ask at the beginning that are contributing to the housing market analysis as part of the qualitative approach to the housing market analysis, which includes literature review and analysis of permitting data where we can find it. So some of these questions at the beginning, you'll remember them from the other panels and focus groups that we have done. So yes, thank you all for taking your time on a work day to come down to our offices. I'm gonna start, we'll have everybody introduce themselves, tell us your name, what community you're with, and anything else you'd like us to know. Terry, you're here first. You can get us started.
My name is Terry Thomas. I am here on behalf of the Culture and Consent Development Community. My background is in the community. I've been a part of the association for the last 50 years since I was a very young person. And my professional background is in education. So I've done taught everything from pre-K to graduate school.
Thank you for being here. Full disclosure, I live in Edgar Gardens Lakeside, so I'm the next neighborhood over. And I know I got your contact information from Mark Washington, who's the president of your civic
Yes.
association. Yes, because I've worked with him in trying to collaborate our civic associations across 33rd. So thank you for being here.
My name's Larry Platt. I'm here on behalf of the town of Chevy Chase in Montgomery County. I am a newly retired lawyer who volunteered to be on the town's long-range planning committee late last year, and now I'm here. I don't have the same background as probably most people here, but I did concentrate in housing finance and legal.
Thank you for being here. My name is for inviting me here. My name is Angelo Otterbein, president of the board for the Sparks Glencoe Community Planning Council. And we are an association focused on land preservation in the watershed north of what we refer to as the Erdel, which is Hun Valley up to the Pennsylvania line and east of I-83. So we represent hundreds of community members, and this ADU idea is very important to us, and I'm appreciative that we have a voice in this.
And we're hybrid, so we will try to, people collecting questions and people here. These are all task force members, there's task force members on, and we have public on listening in also, but just feel comfortable with the fact that you're in the room, and we'll let you know if questions are coming in.
Can I ask you a question? So what community, excuse me, are you in the Baltimore area?
Yes,
In the city or the?
yeah, right in the city, no, near City High School, Coachman, the borders have changed with rezoning, but basically from Clifton Park down to 25th Street over to Lock River Boulevard and coming down 33rd Street to Hartford Road.
You're speaking to somebody who doesn't really know.
Oh,
the streets, but I got it,
In
okay,
Baltimore City,
yeah. And then nobody's with an HOA, right?
no.
Yeah, we had an HOA representative. I want to thank Quinn for helping connect us with somebody who worked with HOAs on the Eastern Shore. Unfortunately, she got pulled into a meeting by her boss. Couldn't help it. Late last week is not able to be here. But I want to thank other members of the task force. James, thank you for connecting us.
Yes, Mr. Platt, I used to be the town administrator for Village Martin's Additions.
Oh, okay.
And I reached out to all the inner city Chevy Chase neighborhoods looking for volunteers for this panel. And you were the I want to say volunteer.
Back.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate it. So of all the Chevy Chase neighborhoods that I used to represent, I'm now the town administrator for Brentwood.
Okay.
So different concepts, but similar inner beltway issues. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that this panel understood, and I've stated it many times, that there are a lot of resources that we have to address when we deal with ADU. So you are our volunteer, if you will, to represent all of the things. And so he's just north of Chevy Chase. No, he's, north of Chevy Chase.
And Tiffany Harris also helped with this panel, if I'm forgetting a task force member who assisted by. But I think we have a great panel, representative of a lot of different areas of the state. And again, appreciate your time. So I know I sent you all the questions ahead of time. I talked with a few of you about the questions themselves. You don't have to be ready to answer every single question. If you can only partially answer a question, or you like, I don't want to answer that question, but I have this to say, I understand that as well. But the questions were just to kind of get your thoughts going. And if we venture into other areas, that's perfect.
Great.
So the first question, this is one of our housing market analysis question. What has your experience taught you about ADUs and the housing market? What prevents them from being a viable housing product? Conversely, what facilitates them as one? And you can answer that however you would like, based on the instructions we just gave. Would anybody like to start off for us?
I'm going to kick my comments to the next question.
Okay.
All right. Yeah.
I'll take the first part of the question.
Sure.
In terms of what prevents them from being a viable housing product is because if you look at what the research shows, when you stack two or three families in a single family dwelling, you increase the poverty rate, you increase the crime rate. But you also look at parking, looking at infrastructure of the city, particularly sometimes with more debris or trash. So that, and I think sometimes those things are not taken into consideration, the quality of life issues. Looking at what schools are available in populations, those kinds of things. So that makes it a difficult in terms of its viability, in terms of the product. And so,
So kind of like the impacts of it on as a project from.
So my experience is informed by, it's exclusively informed by me talking to people at the town that have been involved in this for several years. And they had a few comments. One, they think that at least in cities like Bethesda, Chevy Chase, and areas like that, where land prices are really high, they think of ADUs more as accessible housing rather than affordable housing. Because at least with respect to newly constructed detached units, the cost of constructing a dwelling unit can be more expensive than rent would support for that size of a unit. So, and that's particularly true in smaller lots. And Chevy Chase has a variety of sizes of lots, but in the smaller lots, it seems really difficult. With respect to attached ADUs, the thinking, but I don't know that it's informed by data, is that attached ADUs are more likely to be used by either family members or mostly family members, although it also could be nannies and, you know, people like that. And the thought that that would provide a major source of accessible housing for people outside of the family is thought to be relatively low.
When you say, one follow-up question, when you say accessible, do you specifically mean for individuals with disability, or you mean accessible as in?
No, I mean, like, so we are, I guess, what you would call close to transit housing, because, you know, we're within a mile of a metro stop. And so accessible in terms of transportation is probably a better way to describe it.
yeah, I would just simply indicate that you also have to look at, there's a difference between urban areas and suburban areas, which you have to take into consideration the impact. So if you're familiar with Baltimore City, for example, if you look at what once thriving neighborhood up near like Garrison Boulevard, where people used to live and the houses were broken down into multiple family dwellings, you now see a lot of urban blight in that area.
Any other response to this question before I move on to the next one? And you go first, Angelo, on the next one.
Okay. Let me just add one other.
Yeah, sure.
So I talked about new construction with respect to detached ADUs. So there's always the question of conversion of existing accessory units. And the problem that we have in Chevy Chase is that most of the existing, or at least many of the existing accessory units are little small garages that abut neighbors' property. And in Chevy Chase, as we'll get into, we have code requirements that say that the side setback lines have to be the same as they are for a new house. So converting a garage that doesn't presently satisfy those setback requirements would not be permitted. So that's one impediment.
Question. What practical issues associated with the development of exchange dwelling units on owner occupied and zoned for single family residential must the task force address? And this language is very specific to what the bill that creates task force assigned to us. So
Well, yeah, when we think about it in a couple of different ways, but one way to think about it is the Chesapeake Bay. And so water is
Maybe hold on.
oh, sorry for speaking.
Do you have mice?
Right.
That would be a lot of mice and I
Very- One big mouse. So water starts from, in many respects, the Pretty Boy Dam, you know, and ends up down at Lock Raven Reservoir and then ends up down in the Chesapeake Bay. And the water quality is really what we pay attention to because it services the whole city here. And once if you've driven north on 83, you'll notice that you get to Timonium and sort of, it goes from urban to suburban, and then you're in rural farmland countryside. And there's a reason for that. And one of the reasons is because we're on, all the properties are on well and septic. And so that is a very different construct than public utilities and public service. And so there are very defined protocols for how much water and how much septic a house can support or requires. And so we have real concerns about if you take something like 1.5 acres of land with one house, which is generally kind of the ratio of a family to a piece of property in terms of not having public septic or sewer, and you suddenly divide that in two, then you're putting significant demand on the soil. And so what happens when you use the bathroom or the shower in the country is it goes into what are called drain fields, and that water percolates down into the soil. And so there is a relationship between density and quality of soil, and ultimately the water that feeds into drinking water that is used everywhere. And so we want to make sure that not only are we paying attention to the Chesapeake Bay and what happens there, but that the water quality, we maintain that water quality. So there are structures in place with the county code, Baltimore County Code, that that provide for things like relatives who want to stay in kind of the barn next door or whatever. And those seem to be working. But we advise strongly against, creating an easy path for building on virgin land. Because not only of all the things I just said, but also the agricultural quality of northern Baltimore County is unlike anywhere. I mean, it's a very special place, and it is impossible to undo development, as we know. So once you lay down concrete or a foundation, you don't get that land back. And so it's just becoming smaller and smaller. And so we really resist the idea of anything building upon those, that kind of property.
Very. I have a long answer, so. I thought what I would do is explain how Town of Chevy Chase has addressed this issue, because I think we've grappled with the various practical issues that came up. So first, by way of background, in 2020, Montgomery County came out with its own code or zoning amendment to facilitate the construction or the availability of ADUs. And there's a state law that grants to towns and municipalities limited authority to take more restrictive actions than the state or a county might take. And after hearings and a lot of review by the town's land use committee, the town relied on that authority to come up with some amendments to its zoning code for ADUs. So first, what I thought I would do is just read what their public policy objectives were, or on which their changes relied, because I think they have some uniform applicability. One is to ensure adequate space between buildings to reduce the risk of fire and to provide safe and adequate passageways between properties and the buildings. I should say, I sent to Joe these zoning amendments, so if you want to put them in the records, that'll be in there.
Thanks for the reminder.
Maintain space between properties so as to protect the privacy of neighbors as well as those of residents of detached ADUs. Third, ensure adequate air and light between properties. Fourth, minimize the flow of stormwater from lots by encouraging the maintenance of open spaces and tree canopy, and protect the town's distinct character by encouraging the retention and maintenance of open space. So what did they do with that? First, they didn't make any changes to attached ADUs. Whatever the county did, that applies. The town's not trying to get in the middle of it. Second, they didn't come up with any requirements for off-street parking, which in a city area can be a big issue, but they didn't think that that was necessary. They provided a clear path for authorization to construct new ADUs and convert existing conforming accessory units, subject to permitting requirements. So you have to get a permit in order to do it. The principal change was to require setbacks, both side and rear, for ADUs that are similar to that of a newly constructed building. So I think the side setback is 10 feet. It's not that much, but it's 10 feet. They did, with respect to rear setback units, permit. They loosened the requirement relative to new construction to make it a little easier for ADUs. So what you can see from that is that there was a real serious look at ADUs, and I think the idea was fine, just keep them within the confines of the rear and setback lines for new buildings, and there were some height issues related to that as well. One issue that the town hasn't really addressed yet, but is starting to pop up, is intent to evade the requirements. And, you know, in law, you see this all the time. I do consumer credit law, and there's lots of areas where there's a statutory provision that was standing above. You can't take anything that's designed to evade these requirements. What we've seen with some of the ADUs is that when you define a dwelling unit, it includes all the things you would expect in a dwelling unit, including cooking facilities. And some people have excluded cooking facilities in an ADU and then, or in an accessory unit. And then after they get the permit and after they've built it, then they put in a little stove or a little microwave or, you know, or whatever. And by doing that, they've avoided the permitting process and the town's review. So the idea of not making it easy to evade the requirements, particularly when these requirements, I think, are pretty straightforward, is something that I think will be addressed in the future.
Eric?
I think I touched upon what I thought the practical issues were associated with it in terms of the infrastructure and quality of life issues. I agree with you because the urban areas have different issues than the urban areas. And so some of you may, who, if you live in the city, you know, for example, some of if I leave out in the evening, I have to walk 2 blocks back to my house because the parking is gone. Because where I live, we have a number of group homes that have popped up. The other issue I would have, how do you ensure that it's an owner occupied facility when you have a number of investors who are purchasing the homes and turning them into multifamily dwellings and who are evading the zoning boards and zoning principles? So that is something that has to be looked at seriously.
Any other thoughts on this question before we move to the next? And I'm gonna save some time at the end for the task force if you have any additional questions. I think we're doing pretty good on time. All right, how can local government, some of these overlap, and you've already touched on these. If you want to reiterate something, that's fine, or if you have something else. How can local government ADU policies and regulations be designed to minimize negative impacts on neighborhood livability?
I mean, I would emphasize the public sewer, nature of public sewer versus well and septic for sure. There are septic systems that are more modern that use sort of bioengineering to improve what gets disposed in the ground or what gets percolated. So there's some sort of technological things that could be added to the regulations. I think I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Larry's point was an excellent one, which is we see this often where someone will get the permits for one thing and then don't need the permits for the second thing. That makes it a bigger problem. And so whatever we can do and enforcement is a challenge. So even with the attached accessory use that we see for relatives, suddenly those can become Airbnbs or apartments. And even though that may be against code, there's no enforcement. And so that becomes a challenge for us. And then secondarily, I think for ADUs, for where we are in rural Maryland, below the Erdl, where there is public sewer, would be what we would encourage or incentivize in terms of where those would go.
And for those who are not, the Erdl is urban rural demarcation line.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, Baltimore County's kind of famous for that.
I thought that was from Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, exactly from that too. It's more fun to say Erdl for sure.
That's true.
But I just want to make sure our audience understand. Okay.
So implicit in your question is that a local government has the legal authority to issue regulations. And so, but for that state law that permits towns and municipalities to enact ordinances that are more restrictive than those of the state or county, the town wouldn't have that authority. So we think that's really important, particularly because I think as a these issues, one size doesn't fit all. And just within the town itself, there's so many different size lots that could address ADUs in different ways. It just seems really important to have the flexibility of a local town that knows its own needs. But more specifically, I would just repeat the ones that I said before, which were stormwater management and rear and side setback lines and height restrictions, as well as perhaps just discuss the idea of not making it easy to evade whatever the requirements are.
I concur, and I think the other thing is how do you determine the population within the dwelling? So that if a house is only equipped to handle X amount of people, what do you do when they supersede that stated amount? How do you enforce that? Goes back to enforcement, and which does not occur frequently.
That expands beyond just ADUs, any residential.
Right.
Have that. Any other responses to this question? Okay, all right, this one has a little bit of HOA, but it's also community input. So let's looking on the positive side here, what benefits, I guess both actually, sorry. What benefits from the perspective of HOAs and our community neighborhood organizations can ADUs provide? Conversely, what are some of the biggest concerns? I think we've already touched on those, but if a new one came to your mind, you can feel free to share. But what are some of the benefits that you might envision for ADUs? If you have.
Reduces the homeless population. That's the only one I can think of.
Okay, no, that's,
I'll
let them go.
Then I'll weigh in. Yeah.
I think it does provide opportunities for aging parents, disabled family members, live-in service providers. And I think also it can provide a source of income for people that are on fixed incomes. And they could rent out and to a person or a family and help offset some of their. So we think that those are two possible.
I don't really have anything to add.
It allow a young couple to save to purchase their own home.
I should also say adding workforce housing.
Any more concerns that haven't been addressed? And then I'll get to Secretary.
Oh,
All
okay.
you.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I'm weighing in here is I've actually written HOA agreements, and in fact, Century was one of the groups that we were talking with on my last deal for this project. And we should reach out to them as a follow-up, but yeah, it's interesting, it's another one size not fit all thing, because HOAs vary from very small groupings of units to very large ones. And so I think oftentimes though, they're applicable because of common areas and because of common infrastructure that's often being paid for across a certain number of units or public spaces or a whole variety of things. So on the benefit side, I would say there's the potential, but then it's based on the fee structure that's set up in the HOA to essentially have more households, I'll call it, contributing to the overall cost of some of those common areas and infrastructure and those types of things, which based on escalations and inflation, a lot of people end up in HOA situations where they really didn't adequately factor in the fact that they might be paying as much monthly for an HOA fee as what some people pay for a mortgage. And so there's the potential could vary, for some of that to be spread across more households as a result. Depends on their fee structure and how that assessment actually results in. I would say the other thing is just diversity of housing type. A lot of times, not always, HOAs are set up for a particular housing product. And that housing product can tend to be, quite frankly, a little bit homogeneous in terms of housing type. And so often you see, everybody moves in, similar age, everybody moves out. And so when you have, just in viable neighborhoods, when you have diversity of housing type, you then actually end up with not that big kind of overhaul of people because they're aging together almost, you know, you actually have the opportunity for mixing that up. On the negative side, you know, I think, basically, yes, usually that development was designed for a certain number of people, a certain amount of capacity, carrying capacity. And those numbers are usually pretty well calculated in terms of what the intent of that carrying capacity was. Now, there's nothing to keep a particular homeowner from having done it myself during COVID. I was in an HOA, but you know, having your child and grandchildren all of a sudden ending up living with you, and in essence, you've created the same situation, just you create another space. You know, using up your extra bedrooms and stuff, and so, but there is that downside of, particularly from a zoning and approval standpoint, there is also calculation. There's an EU calculation of the carrying capacity in the water and sewer, which all of a sudden shifts. And so I think in that instance, it's sort of like, well, what's the increment? You know, like maybe it's a certain percentage of total or something, but I think it is something that has to be looked at carefully because there are pros and cons from, you know, my perspective in these situations, yeah.
I don't want to open this up to all the task force yet, but I do want to get, James, I know since you helped put this task force together, you said you had some thoughts on this, and I told you to hold off on it, but I think we're doing good on time. But I want to give you, I don't know if it's specific to this question, if you want to come back later, but.
No, I think Mr. Platt, right? I think he's emphasized what the inner county and inner cities issues are for the most part. The only thing that he hasn't touched on is the administrative side, and that's where I come into play. So Mr. Platt doesn't have to deal with extra trash. Mr. Platt doesn't have to deal with streets and things of that nature. So these are issues that, from my perspective, they're not raised. However, Mr. Platt is presenting what needs to be addressed when it comes to quality of life issues and things of that nature. The one thing and it was one of the reasons I really wanted someone from the Chevy Chase area, because the county made a law, and then the inner county cities made an adjustment to address that, such as how homes can be over 35 feet. If you have an ADU, you must provide 2 off-street parking spots. And if you can't do that, you can't have one. The idea that once you pass the permitting and then have other things added on afterwards, we deal with that because you have to do an annual renewal. So if my code enforcement officer comes to your house, you passed it 1 year and then you put it in the kitchen the next year, you would then fail and then you could not have the rental application. So that's ways of getting around those types of things. But I think Mr. Platt has been he's given exactly what we needed for the inner towns and cities. The big difference between where I currently represent versus where I used to represent is that there are a lot more minorities in my area. And so when you talk about families, we've got 2 and 3 generations of folks living in one house, right? And so you throw a garage and things of that nature, you can have 8, 9 people in there. So the other issue about diversity is that a lot of them do construction, they do lawn, so they have cars, they have vans. And so they have to get to and from work. And so that makes my job that much harder because I get complaints from Mr. This guy's got 8 cars in his house, and that's not far-fetched. You'd be surprised. So thank you, Mr. Platt, once again from a residence standpoint.
Can I just confirm, Mr. Gasson, that you're not volunteering me to get involved in any of these administrative issues? Thank you.
This is the whole thing has been a recruitment. Really
I
win.
need to protect my space.
All right, we're gonna move on here. Thank you. All right, so covenants has been a big topic of conversation in this task force, and it repeatedly comes up in literature nationwide, other state legislation related to ADUs. So what related to ADUs should recorded covenants be able to regulate or prohibit? Some examples, but not by no means limited to design, size, location. What should they not be able to regulate? So let's start with the first.
So I lived in an HOA for 16 years. And my experience was that at least in that HOA, it had lost the ability to enforce any of its rules because of inconsistent enforcement over the years. So they had rules on the width of siding and the color of siding and things like that. But you could go back over the years and find sometimes they enforced them, sometimes they didn't. And so when they tried to enforce them, people fought it in court and won. So the idea that an HOA takes on a, if you will, a state type function, I think is going to be less effective than actually just relying on local zoning rules.
I don't know if this falls in the realm of covenants, but we would really welcome some requirement around, say, the maintenance of a septic system. So a failed septic system is a big problem. And that combined with groundwater use. So I'm not a groundwater expert, but let's just say a bedroom requires 150 gallons a day of water. Then there's a certain limit, and maybe it's called carrying capacity, but there's certain things that need to be thought about in terms of what the recorded documented thing is. And I don't know if that gets laid out in a covenant or not, but the maintenance of the septic system, the amount of water being required for the particular property. And then also one thing that hasn't been brought up for, at least for rural Maryland, is pervious surface. And so how much are we paving versus gravel or some other solution that allows the rainwater to drain into the, so anything around that would provide some level of enforcement or regulation, I think would be welcome.
Sorry. The attorneys in the room may be able to correct me on this, but the covenants that I believe they refer to are the restrictions that go with versus the zoning
Gotcha.
and public kind of regulations and whatnot. And so if I'm reading your intent here, Joe, CCRs, covenants, and restrictions, those covenants, restrictions specific to the deed, I would be very cautious about putting anything in writing, because that actually can come back to bite the homeowner, because when you put those types of restrictions in your deed transfer, and they're good sometimes, but really caution, because it can actually really impact the transfer of deed and the sale of property. But please, there's an attorney for me on that.
That's true.
But that's.
And the financing,
Well,
and the financing as well. So if you want to be able to get a loan that's ultimately bought by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac,
Right.
they're going to have restrictions on what types of deed limits or covenants running with the land that
We don't
are.
want too much of that. Typically, we've always, in any development deals I've done, I've always stayed away from overreaching inside of covenants and that deed restriction, and really leaned on more like, typically there's a homeowner association agreement, and in that agreement, which usually has to be filed with the town has to have a provision in their approvals of things like a design review committee, or certain bylaws can't be changed. It's kind of in your bylaws, but the bylaws can't be changed without notification of the town or the municipality or something like that. So I just want to be really clear in the types of documents. So
There's also no arbiter, right? If it's in a deed and there's some confusion on its meaning, you got to go to court.
yeah,
That is not a way to go.
Harry? Only got a couple questions left, now I'll put them to the test voice for additional questions. Maybe one I can, anyway. This is very specific, mostly specific to HOAs, but how should ADUs be assessed when it comes to HOA or the community neighborhood expense? Should ADUs be subject to a separate additional assessment beyond that of the primary dwelling, or should all properties be treated equally regardless of whether there is a need or not? Thank Quinn for helping develop this question. I modified your language a little bit, Quinn. But, thank you for helping develop this.
I mean, I'm always willing to talk about stuff about which I know nothing. And on this one, to the extent that the expenses are prorated based on living space, then it seems to me you could account for the living space added by an ADU. If HOAs don't do that by virtue of living space, then I'll let other people weigh in.
I think they should have to pay more. They are increasing the terminology, the burden on the infrastructure, so they should have to pay additional fees. You know, because why, if I'm in a single family dwelling and I'm the only person there, et cetera, or a nuclear family, and then there are 8 or 9 people who are using one single family dwelling, they're creating a greater impact on the resources.
Yeah, once again, keeping in mind all the same, typically the fees pay for maintenance of common areas, use of a clubhouse if there's one, any type of connectivity. It could even include if there's private streets, you know, the maintenance of those streets and whatnot. And they're typically assessed based on the square footage, because if you have a smaller unit, it's probably going to have less occupancy versus a very larger one. But there are different metrics that are used for assessment, because more than likely, that results in a larger unit size, essentially. Like,
Well, I was thinking more of the ADUs as opposed to the HOAs, because let's face it, in the HOA community, you're going to look at probably people who are more affluent than people who are living in maybe, like I said, certain areas of the city that are less affluent. If you are living in if you're familiar with Baltimore, Roland Park, Charles Village, and some certain aspects of it, your income is certainly higher. So that, and if you look at, you know, if you look at Baltimore City houses on Calvert Street, for example, there used to be single family dwellings. There are now multiple family dwellings. On the outside, facades look excellent. Go inside the dwellings, and some of them, you shake your head, and you wonder. So, and I'm talking about some of those buildings have been divided into 4 family units or 4 apartments, and they are probably not up to code. But again, it goes back to what the gentleman said about code enforcement. You know, it's lacking in many areas. So I think that if you're going to break up those dwellings, you need to pay more if it's ADU as opposed to HOA.
and I will say, it's not all HOAs are just fluent
Mhm.
communities. I've actually used that.
You know, I said mostly because if I may personalize. So for example, where most of my relatives live in Howard County, there are HOAs, and they're not economically challenged.
Yeah.
So that the benefits are different as well, as opposed to if you are in a less developed or a less affluent area, or even a lower middle class area, that you see the differences. Goes back to when the gentleman talked about, if you go to Hollandtown in Baltimore, where you have a large minority community, where you have 4 or 5 cars on the street. Where I live, for example, in Coldstream Park, you see people who have 5 and 6 cars, and you can't park. You know, you know, the community parks are overloaded. You know, fortunately, there's Clifton Park that they can go, but if you look at all those infrastructure things and the quality of life issues, I think they should have to contribute to that.
I want to give Quinn, I don't know if you had any thoughts or clarifications for your question. It's okay if you don't, but I'm going to, as the drafter of this question, I want to share anything.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the comments. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Again, just trying to get a temperature of the room as far as feelings. The last question related to assessments. And again, I speak from experience. I'm an attorney. I practice community association law in both Maryland and Delaware. You know, with condominiums, I know we're not talking about condominiums, but condominiums typically, the assessments are allocated on their percentage interest of the common elements. The HOA is a little bit different because the HOA, the actual association, owns the common elements. And as the chair mentioned, each year there's typically a budget adopted that sets forth the common expenses for each individual within that community. And obviously, if you're bringing more individuals into the community, you're adding dwelling units or accessory dwelling units into the community, then I think that we should focus on the potential ripple effect of those assessments related to the individuals within the community. And again, I think, some people buy into HOAs because there are deed restrictions and there's certain limitations on what their neighbor can and cannot do. Some think that that's a benefit. So again, just try to take a temperature check and hear some of the discussion.
Yeah, one more. Nope, we don't have, that was the last question. Well, I guess I'm gonna give you all any closing words. But then we're gonna open it up to some questions, so you have more time. Do you have any closing thoughts, Angela?
Yeah, thank you.
Larry? No closing thoughts, all right, the questions encapsulated everything. Well, I would like to open it up to the task force members. See if you have any follow-up questions for
I'll go.
can you explain your name and where you're from for the panel, like who you're representing? There you go.
Yes, I'm Priscilla Kania. I'm with AARP Maryland. So let me start by my assumption is that when we talk about ADUs, accessory dwelling units, we're not talking about multifamily houses, and we're not talking about splitting a house in half or in quarters. We're talking about having a primary house with some smaller section in the house or attached to the house or detached from the house. So it would be a small unit, like 500 square feet or something like that. We're not talking about a place where you'd put a family of 8 people, just little thing. So with that in mind, I wonder whether the three of you would either have continue to support or not support, but continue as is and have a lot of non-permitted ADUs in your areas, or whether you would rather have regulation over them and some control over what happens so that if somebody does have an ADU, they can get it zoned properly, they can get it permitted and inspected and so on. I mean, because right now we have the wild, wild west. Anybody who wants to, and they still will, can just stick something in their house and they can do it without a permit, which means there are no fire regulations, there's no nothing. So I'm kind of wondering what you're thinking about that.
Well, Baltimore, I can speak to Baltimore County. I mean, they have an accessory use code. I mean, you can, and so there's already something available for.
Is it too restrictive to get permits? I mean,
It's been loosened a little bit, so it was direct line relatives, and now it's a little less, I forget the exact language, but it's sort of second in line, bloodline kind of thing. So there is language, there's a permit process, and it works pretty well. I think what we're worried about is the big barn next to the house that becomes a second family home, and then an Airbnb, and it's a slippery slope is really, and then you could say, well, this is my aunt, who I'm taking care of. And then that suddenly becomes, the aunt's friend, and then and so that.
so do you have thoughts on maximum sizes for ADU? Something that you think would be reasonable in Baltimore County?
I think it's really about what the property can support, and not requiring a lot of new development in terms of a second wing of the house, whatever it might be. So I think a lot of it's about the property itself. But in general, the way that's the law is written for Baltimore County is that it's meant just for like a relative to stay, like an in-law, which makes sense and we would support.
Right. And let me add to my question, what we're finding is like the average price, in order to put an accessory dwelling unit on the property, it's going to cost like $150,000 at least. So I mean, it's not easy. And I can tell you in Anne Arundel County, they've had the law in for about a year and they've had 13 approved permits. So I mean, it's not like mass chaos. Anyway, so
Well, that's why I'm sorry.
No, I think the way you framed it, it would be acceptable. However, but we know from circumstances and happenstance, most people are not doing it that way. You may see it as an add-on in a small way, 500 square feet or whatever. But in too many instances, particularly again in the city, that's not the case. First of all, there's no space in because many of the homes are row houses. So you see, you don't see the analogy that you gave. You see, again, they become multiple family dwellings. They're overcrowded.
But
So
what if they're only allowed to do one small conversion within a house?
how do you enforce it?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is there-
Policy.
I understand it's called enforcement.
Different issue.
Okay.
We're talking policy, we're talking policy.
Right.
And a lot of things, like I'm hearing a mix up of code enforcement during this panel discussion and policy. It's two different things.
Okay, but the policy, if you have a policy and you cannot enforce the code, then what do you have?
Well, enforce your code. If you're
Okay.
a governmental entity and you're not enforcing your code, I suggest you enforce your code.
Well, I'm not a governmental entity. I am a private citizen who's here, and I understand what you're saying. I'm simply saying that the two are joined together. They're not separate issues.
But my question
Okay,
is,
so I agree with you.
have a law
Mhm.
that says you can have this as a definition of an ADU. And then you can apply for a permit and so on, versus what's happening now, which is the wild, wild west.
And I said, I agree with you. I think that's a great idea if you can make sure it happens that way.
But to the enforcement question, I think that's it's a fair point, but how do you enforce whether someone's related to another person? Like that's fundamentally where that line is.
Well, depending on how your code was written, when you apply for verification, there's a lot of ways to address that. That's if you would have an ADU ordinance that was tied to somebody related relative.
Which is not necessarily
Which
a
is
great
not
idea,
necessarily.
because then you have a resale problem and everything else.
Gotcha.
Dwelling units generally are regulated through a zoning code. So this is really just an overlay of a different type of dwelling unit and accessory dwelling unit.
Right.
And I think I think if you look at what the town of Chevy Chase did, not with my involvement, but you'll see that they really tried to balance the legitimate interests of existing homeowners and a larger public policy of trying to increase the availability of housing. But really focusing on things like storm water management and privacy and spacing and things like that. So I think it's really doable, but I just think dwellings generally are subject to zoning laws, at least in the city and in the suburbs, maybe not way out in the, in the rural areas. So it's just an overlay.
Any other questions from the task force?
Quite an observation, I think, to this recent conversation, I think for the task force is policy is only as good as its ability to be enforced. And so I think we do have to be mindful of any recommendations that aren't practical in the ability to enforce. And so I think that this is clearly an important observation, I think, is that some of it's just not practical. This is going on in my neighborhood and I live in a rural area, and it's sort of like there's not enough bandwidth already, and so we really have to think about any recommendations that, are not so overdone. I've seen this all the time, policy so overdone that it becomes meaningless. And then just. So I think that's a really good reminder for us as the task force. And I think, we are continuing to look at all these models out there, the reality that we know is happening. Separate from whatever we do with ADU, we got a problem in some of these areas, and that's also based on the housing shortage. And so these things all start interconnecting. And then I think we also have some good models that have been in existence long enough that we can help you see what's happening. And then we do have these carrying capacity issues. So I think we're still struggling with what are the right metrics as it relates to the carrying capacity, or the metrics related to, these new additional load, shall we call it, on a particular street or neighborhood, whatever. I think.
We also have two task force members with raising hand.
Oh, okay, great. Well, Joe, you.
I think there's first, we'll get back. Lori? Please tell us, say who you are, where you're from.
Morning, my name is Lori Paris. I'm the Mako representative from Urban. I just wanted to just bring up two quick points, and I think that when we were discussing kind of the familial relationship, I think this is going to go for the attorney in the room. I think we need to be very careful when we're talking about that because you're going to have fair housing protections, and so defining family under the Fair Housing Act, the 6 and all of that. So I just want to flag that as when we're kind of talking about this, to keep that in the back of our minds. The second thing is, I agree with the secretary's statement is, and I think it goes to the other gentleman who was speaking, I couldn't tell from my screen, that it's correct, like the policy has to be something that can be enforceable. Because when you are drafting this policy and then it's going to be enacted at the county level, depending on how it is, the county has to be able to enforce it. So I think we just need, and I agree with the secretary, we just have to think about it and make sure what we're doing is enforceable from a perspective of either funding, staffing, or actually just being able to either say this is in violation or not. So I just want to also keep that at the forefront. Those are my two comments.
Thank you, Lori. Amy, you lowered your hand. Did you still want to say something?
Yeah, I think
Can you
that.
say where you're from, just for the
Yep.
panelists?
Yep, I'm Amy Murdoch. I'm the planning director in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, and I'm Mako's rural representative on this task force. And that's the perspective I wanted to get. Yes?
You're back now. You're back now.
Okay. I think that Lori hit upon the core of what I wanted to add, but I think this conversation about enforceability is key to how we're going to move forward. A rural jurisdiction and urban jurisdiction, we all have the same responsibilities, but I think keeping in perspective the fact that a lot of the blame in terms of how affordable housing options are not available falls on zoning. Some of it is valid and some of it is not. And I think that the conversation that we've just had illustrates that point. Local jurisdictions are asked to be flexible when it comes to supporting accessory dwelling units and affordable housing options, and we often are flexible. Our departments of public works are flexible in the way that we look at accessory units for family members versus a more for-profit rental use. But when you get down to the nuts and bolts of writing policy and then zoning laws, I think that this conversation should be revisited in terms of what is it that we're really trying to do and who is it that we're really trying to support in terms of writing enforceable requirements for accessory dwelling units. I think this conversation has really gotten to the heart of what we've been building toward in our last several meetings.
Thank you, Amy. You say.
Oh, I'm Deborah Bilo. I represent American Institute of Architects. And I think the discussion on the policy aspect is really interesting. It's pulling something out that maybe we haven't addressed so much yet. And not the policy kind of governance, the actual implications of how this is, how these new rules are incorporated or not. So that is maybe something we need to address a little bit more, but my other sort of thought about this is bigger picture. I wish we had some metrics that would talk about how many ADUs actually are we talking about? What's the projections of ADUs? I mean, we talk about the impact to infrastructure, to septic, to environmental. I think about Charles County where they have massive problems with water. With groundwater, and yet they're developing faster than any place else. Well, maybe I'm making that up, but I feel like
Not 80 fastest.
but they're developing pretty fast. So I just think about the implications on a much broader scale, and we're talking about, you know, these small single family ADUs. So just keeping in mind that bigger picture and then thinking through some of these zoning implications. a lot of what we're also addressing, especially setbacks, size, heights. I don't know that we have said we're going to be, and this is something we should definitely be very clear on, that we're going to say these are the rules and the regulations. No, for sure, the counties need to be the ones saying, this is my perspective, the counties need to be the ones saying, what are those setback requirements? And that's gonna be a thing that decides whether or not it's possible. What is the lot, what can the lot carry? What can the lot carry, really? And we don't know, right? But when that's known through the zoning study, that's gonna immediately kind of shuffle off some of the ones that are more questionable. And that's not hard to enforce, I don't think, because it's already built into the enforcement system and it's something everyone's familiar with and it's something we're all already doing. That's it.
Jennifer? We'll go.
So my name's Jennifer Ray. I am the one with the longest card here, an individual with professional experience, blah, blah, blah. I am a degree in engineering, a certification in planning, and am a transportation planner. I work with JMT. I have written, well, a couple of thoughts. One, I started writing my final thoughts because we always come to that. And then I'm like, well, everybody's hit on them already. The enforcement for permitting, I 100% agree. I think that's a major concern. And while I recognize, the codes versus the policies, they are absolutely, integrated. We keep coming back to this meeting after meeting too, and I've written it down multiple times of defining the ADU. And I feel like that's always a key component in our conversation. And you really bring it to light in your statements of there's multiple families. And if you go down to Charles Village and, there's homes that are, it's still a home and they're renting rooms for, Hopkins students and others. There's family members, as you noted, Chair, of just putting, I still have space in my home and I've rented a room, where does this, and we have a definition, but I feel like it's making sure we always come back to that. But really what I wanted to ask, and this comes back to, especially, with looking at our rural areas, having had our office up off of Loveton Circle and then moved down to White Avenue. One of the things I have written a number of master plans, whether they're transportation-based, pedestrian, bicycle throughout Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic region. And one of the things that we will frequently do is we have an exclusion for those on septic and well systems. And so I wanted to just kind of throw that out there for thought. So it basically, especially in some, wrote one for Anne Arundel County for pedestrian bicycle master plan, and we excluded areas for that policy regarding anything that was not on public water and sewer because there were so many nuanced elements. So I wanted to get your.
I think that's great.
Process on that.
I mean, it would make a ton of sense. I think what we worry about every day is the Dr. Seuss or not, the Erdl continuing to press northern. So until it reaches the Pennsylvania line. And so provided that we can, I don't know if that helps or hurts us, our ability to keep pushing back and not having that line move, because eventually we will run out of farmland and everything sort of impact the water supply. And so, but yes, I think that would make a ton of sense.
And I recognize, there's consequences, there's intended and unintended consequences with that statement. I just wanted to put that out there during the panel discussion. Maybe it's something we can dive into more in additional discussion. But I was curious on your thoughts on that and others as well. Sorry, not to exclude. There's not within the Erdls.
I'd be curious to understand that. Sorry.
Dan Huff, City of Westminster, Maryland Municipal League. On septics, because I've done a lot of work related to septics over the years. Typically, you design a septic based on the number of bedrooms. So just as we have public infrastructure capacity issues, if I have an ADU, if I have a 3-bedroom house and a 1-bedroom ADU, quite frankly, that's no different than having a 4-bedroom house. They're not much different, okay? So if I'm going to construct an ADU on my 1.5 acre lot, and I'm adding an extra bedroom, I imagine the health department at that point in time, if it's an extra bedroom over what I'm already approved for, is going to want me to do additional things to make sure that I can handle the extra capacity. So, the private versus public is the same issue. It just depends on what kind of capacity. Because, some of our cities, like the city of Westminster, we have limited capacity when it comes to water and sewer. So we have to take that into account, but it really depends on how many people are actually living in the unit. And the best way that people get at that from a health department standpoint is the number of bedrooms. That's typically how you do it from a septic standpoint. The other thing I just want to remind us here, we're here, we're making recommendations. We are not making determinations. We're making recommendations. And the reason we're here is because the Maryland General Assembly wants us here to make recommendations. Because overall, there is a housing crisis in the state. There is a affordability crisis in the state, and there's a diversity of housing stock. People cannot find, something to live. So this is just one avenue. ADUs is just one avenue to try to solve that problem. Anyone who's paying attention to Annapolis, I believe you're going to testify later today, the housing package. So this is a real issue. So I just kind of want to bring us back to that, is at the end of the day, we do need to think about all these issues related to ADUs, but the General Assembly is looking for us to make recommendations. Because very likely, it would not surprise me at all if, in the future, there is an ADU ordinance that is going to get birthed out of this task force that's going to end up in Annapolis. That has happened in other states. I think with some of the issues that are going on here, and we do need to think about the, enforcement and code, because the more complicated we make this, the harder you make the enforcement. I agree with that. But policy is different than, I guess I hold on that part that, we should be talking about the policy standpoint, because the code enforcement is really on the governmental authorities to make sure they're actually enforcing their code, because that's a separate issue. So those kind of wandered into several different areas, but I kind of wanted to just make some of those points.
Can I just get clarification on the septic? Because, yeah, so I mean, and I've encountered that several times in my own practice, that when you go to apply for a permit, if you're adding a bedroom, that's what impacts whether or not you have to do work on your septic system or not. What are some of the complications that could arise from an ADU on a septic system? Could you give examples that are not true of city water and sewer?
Specific to ADUs at this time, I can't. It was truly throwing that out there, something that I have encountered professionally within different types of master plans. And I stated majority of them transportation-based master plans. And it was a way to essentially recognizing that the information regarding public water and sewer is typically more known, easier to access. You're not going into individual properties. So it made the approval process kind of more blanket size versus not prohibiting necessarily, but leaving that more within the local jurisdiction and not having it in a blanket policy so that locally it could be addressed more. But specific to an ADU, I don't have a good example on that. It was more
Maybe it's,
transportation based.
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Maybe it's down to what the definition is. I mean, there's a difference between adding a bedroom and putting up a new structure with a 2-bedroom apartment that's right next to it in terms of, and we don't wake up every day thinking about how our drain fields are getting filled up and how they're getting used, because we're not, as citizens, we don't think about that. And so you may get the permit, but then suddenly you're putting a load on the system that may not handle.
The implication there is a bedroom means a person is still using the same cooking and washing facilities.
Right.
An ADU, somebody's introducing new washing.
Yeah, so groundwater management is asking about dishwashers and washing machine, like all that other stuff that comes with a fully self-contained unit as opposed to another bedroom.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I will point out that utilities, water particularly, are going to be the main topic of our discussion in March. So I hope everybody keeps this stuff in mind, because we're going to be looking at local ordinances and issues around it as well. So it's good to talk about it now, but just we will be revisiting it. Yes, Mandy and the James, that we need to stop. we need to move forward with the agenda.
I don't remember exactly what it was called, but it might be through the Bay Foundation. I know that there is a program out there based on your income about upgrading your septic system with the BAT technology. And even with septic in the ground, I mean, it does have a lifespan, these tanks, correct? So whether you're adding an ADU or addition on your house, you have to make sure your septic is up to date, or after a certain amount of time, it does have to be replaced.
Well, that's a great point. So a drain field, I think the average lifetime is like 25 years.
Yeah.
And so then you have to find another place to put a drain field. And I don't believe that the permit, maybe it's an enforcement, but the permitting requires a BAT because it's an extra cost and a burden on the homeowner, but those do make a huge difference. And so the Chesapeake Bay does support them through grants, and that has had a positive impact on how well the land can sustain ongoing. But yes, there is a lifetime. So the drain fields, not necessarily the tank, but the drain fields.
So your septic field, I am very familiar with this. Your septic field, you have to have 3 areas. You have to have your original area and then 2 replacements in modern septic design. So in theory, like if my drain field fails, I already have a approved location for another system. And then if that system fails, I already have another area for yet a 3rd system. And in theory, okay, I'm going down a rabbit hole, is the areas that you no longer have the drain field in, if you imagine 50 years worth of time, that soil in theory can recover and be able to be reused. But it all depends on the quality of the soil that you're in. Some septic areas, especially older, might be in poorer quality soil than if I'm in real sandy soil and it's great. So, has nothing to do with the tank, it all has to do with the field.
Last thoughts, James?
Yeah, for March, you guys were talking, water and utilities. I think I know I need to do this, Steve, the solid waste.
Well, I would put utilities kind of in that.
Okay, I just want to make sure. Solid waste is my biggest issue right now. There's 4 different areas. There's food food scraps, whatever. There is, recyclables. There is trash, and then there's yard waste. So I have to deal with 4 different types of trash, if you will. And it's all different. And the minute you throw an extra bedroom ADU on, that doubles, depending on how many people have to live. That's my issue.
So,
We are at our time.
okay, I'm gonna, first of all, thank you all.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, we're trying to make sure we've looked at every aspect of this to sort of be able to make good recommendations. I'm gonna propose we do a 5-minute break and come back, and also, I just want to add a thought, because I am gonna be on my way to testify for one of the housing bills, is that we as Marylanders are kind of stuck right now. We have a 96,000 person housing gap. We can wait until the infrastructure comes, or we can build and make the, this is a holistic issue. And so if we don't do anything, because we don't have adequate infrastructure, then our economies will start floundering. And so we are all, I think, part of that puzzle, and it's all gonna have to be holistic decision-making around how do we, as a state, really look at all of these interconnections and figure out how do we provide for the people that are piling in, into single-family homes that aren't meant to house 4 different households, and how do we deal with young people who can't afford to live in Maryland anymore, or aging people. This is holistic. I think our piece of that puzzle here, to the earlier point, we really do need to go back to our charge each and every time. We need to go back to the definition each and every time. What are we talking about here? Because as we try to start bringing this in, there is no silver bullet here. We are just going to have to ensure that we provided good guidance and recommendations. So I really do thank the folks that have come to help us with this. And if there's any other additional thoughts, from anybody that may be listening in, we are listening to your thoughts. So let's take 5 minutes if that's okay.
So back at 11:03.
Yeah.
Back at 11:10.
Yes, and moving on to what's our next?
We're gonna look at the parking, today's topic, which is parking. So.
Okay, so just a quick break and
You all are
that door will lock
welcome.
behind
You
you.
want to stay, you know. No.
Thank you.
I know. You don't have to, but you're welcome. Thank you, Angela.
Yes.
So this lends itself very well to the panel discussion, parking and community facilities.
Did we capture that chat that was up there? Is that anything we need to be aware?
Just Lisa.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, thanks, Lisa. So we know you're there. Okay.
Okay, so.
And just a reminder, this is all being recorded too, right?
This is all being.
So I do have the ability to go back and listen to the recording for what I missed, so I appreciate.
Do it in your car too.
There you go. I wonder if I can get my AICP CEUs from doing that. Still trying. That's done.
You can take credit.
You can, you should be able to. I don't.
On
think I
the
can.
self-reported?
Yeah, sure. I bet you can. Volunteers.
We're live. So some resources, examples related to this topic. We've looked at a lot of the ARP resources, and as we stated before, they're helpful. One for their model ordinance. This ordinance promotes not having an off-street parking requirement for ADUs. So that ordinance has that. It does suggest that off-street spots should be replaced if the construction of an ADU removes one. And this is something we'll see in some of our examples later as well. It also promotes substituting off-street parking for on-street parking if the neighborhood has sufficient curb area. The next one is design and accessory dwelling unit regulations. This was developed as recommendations for Alexandria, Virginia, by the Urban Institute. We're going to look at Alexandria later when we look at some recent legal challenges to ADU laws. It quotes from The Backdoor Revolution, the definitive guide to ADU development by Cole Peterson from 2018. And I'm going to read from that directly what that source says. Parking requirements impede ADU development for several reasons. On many lots, building an additional parking spot is either impossible or highly undesirable. Building parking spot spaces can cost the homeowner $3,000 to $5,000 per spot, excluding curb cuts. Even if it is possible to get parking requirements waived, extensive review and permitting process to ease restrictions is burdensome to new developers who are typically just homeowners. California ADU handbook, we've looked a lot at California's law, and we'll look at it again later today. They have strong state legislation promoting ADUs, but they also developed a handbook to support implementation of the legislation at the local level. That handbook includes FAQs. One of the questions is, can school, so this, we're mostly talking about parking today. We are going to talk a little bit about other community facilities and schools. So one of the questions in that FAQs is, can school districts charge impact fees? The answer on that resource is yes. And I'll put the response to the question. School districts are authorized to, but do not have to, levy impact fees for ADUs greater than 500 square feet. Okay, you know, they have a very specific legislation related to the size of the ADU when it comes to schools. ADUs less than 500 square feet are not subject to school impact fees. Local agencies are encouraged to coordinate with school districts to carefully weigh the importance of promoting ADUs and showing appropriate nexus studies and appropriate fees to facilitate construction or reconstruction of adequate school facilities. And then finally, I'm going to point out a couple examples that developed of municipalities that have fairly newer expansions of their ADU ordinances. One is Durango, Colorado. They also developed an informational webpage to educate stakeholders on its ordinance and its resources. That webpage notes that one of the significant changes adopted in 2022 is that in most cases, on-street parking can be counted towards total parking requirements. So they're specifically calling that out, that on-street could be calculated toward that. Portland, Oregon developed a similar webpage for its ADU ordinance and program, which notes that additional on-site parking is not required for an ADU. So sometimes they use on-site, sometimes they use off-street. So I might switch back and forth, but on-site and off-street do the same thing. Additional on-site parking is not required for ADU. However, if parking is required for the existing dwelling units, that parking must either be retained or replaced on site. Here again, we see a requirement to replace any off-street parking lost due to the construction of a new ADU. We're gonna look at some Maryland examples here. As a reminder to the audience and others, we have the full inventory available. We've had for a while at that link. This website, or this presentation will also be posted to the webpage after the meeting. So let's Maryland summarize. We looked at a variety of ordinances related to this topic. Requiring at least one off-street parking spot is more common than not. Sometimes they require two. There's a lot of duplication, like exact language duplication in the parking requirements for ADU ordinances around the state, which is not necessarily a bad thing. They're learning from each other. But I would say that this is more than other topics. I saw a lot of duplication. The requirements in relation to those of the prime are often the requirements are developed in relation to those of the primary dwelling and condition of parking on the site. There is some variability on this around the state based on transit access or proximity to transit. Oftentimes, unit size impacts the number of spaces required. We'll take an example of that later. And many of them include location and screening of parking spaces. That's a requirement. Ordinance. So we'll look at some that are approved. We looked back at by right approval process way back in, I think it was November. So here's the ones that are approved by right. So for Newmarket, they have a minimum total of 4 off-street parking spaces. That's this, if you have an ADU, that means 2 for the ADU or 2 for the primary dwelling, but there has to be a minimum of 4.
Wow,
The exception, yeah, seems it's a lot.
that's a lot of paved area if they're paving those.
Yeah.
They have an exception if that you can verify, written verification that the occupants of the accessory dwelling with age or physical disability will not have vehicles on site. Right, so that's, they put a lot of thought into that and there's a lot of requirements and very specific.
James?
Yeah, I apologize. So what happens when that home is sold to someone else? How do you make the determination as to whether or not they're not gonna have vehicles?
I don't have the answer for that, but that's a good question. It gets back to a lot of the conversation we saw today about enforcing this stuff, right? Like how do you, when you put these layers of things on top of it, the lifetime of that unit, how is this enforced? How is it monitored? It becomes difficult. Okay, so Gaithersburg is an example of off-street parking requirements based on ADU size. So it's 0 to 699 square feet. You have to have 1 per ADU, up to 900 to 1,200 square feet. You need to have 2 per dwelling. And then Montgomery County is an example of one where if there's some verification or consideration of access to transit. All right, so except for lots within 1 mile of those fixed transit station, fixed rail transit stations, in 1 on-site parking space or off-street at the same.
Joe, I'm sorry. Do we know if those requirements are based on something new that's being invoked specific to an ADU, or are those requirements already there on the books? Because what I'm interested in is trying to figure out, is this something to create a barrier to ADUs, or is this something that's already in the code in terms of the amount of off-street per size?
I will say that
Which one are you talking about? Gaithersburg or Montgomery County?
I would say, I actually more so Newmarket and Gaithersburg were those things that were already on the books based on something, and this is additive.
So this is where Mr. Platt and I come into play.
Yeah.
The county created, we need to create affordable housing. If you
Yeah.
have X lot,
Uh-huh.
acre, half an acre, what have you, you are able to put on an ADU. What the inner counties did, or the inner cities did, was make additional regulations to require, to stop that. So from the county's perspective, they were looking at Maryland is in a housing crunch. We need X, Y, and Z, AARP. However, for quality of life issues for those who live inside the Beltway, where spacing and resources are difficult to come by, they created another layer of, we're going to stop this. Well, not stop, but curtail it to make sure that our quality of life for our current citizens, you know, aren't impeded on by the counties. And Mr. Platt can help me with this, the county's love for having affordable housing for all.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No,
That's-
yeah, that's
and I can't
exactly
speak
what
for
I'm trying to
Gaithersburg.
figure out.
I cannot speak for Gaithersburg because that's one of those outer,
Mm-hmm.
but for the inner ones, that was the gist of what they were.
County said, let's do this, and the municipality said, not so fast, we're gonna put some stuff on there
Right,
that
so, right, so
cover.
the easiest
cover
one to
our
do
real
is,
situation.
you have an ADU, you have to provide not one, but two off-street parking.
Wow.
And if anyone's been inside the Beltway of District of Columbia, that is virtually impossible, because you already have your own home.
Yeah.
With two parking spaces.
So they shut it down.
Yeah, that
Pretty much.
that was easy.
That's what I was trying to figure out. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. I apologize for that.
No, I appreciate it, because that's what I was trying to get to.
Right, so it was like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Fell, and then the rest of them just started falling.
Yeah.
Right, so these are some examples that, the ones that are approved by special exception. We also talked about that. November. So for Leonardtown, two off-street parking spots and required screening to ensure compatibility and minimize impact on the neighborhood. For Caroline County, adequate parking is determined during the special exception group. So that as we remember when we were back there, a lot of those are subjective criteria when we're talking about special exception group. And for Cambridge, one off-street parking spot is required and can be permitted in setback areas where through tandem parking, it won't block emergency vehicles. Because a lot of things that Larry brought up today, we're talking about the town of Chevy Chase, blocking emergency vehicles, and what do you do about setback areas? And we looked at setback areas as well when we were in the December meeting, we were talking about lot requirements and whether or not ADUs can impede or extend into those setbacks. So you'll see these are also related to parking. I want to point out this. So this is from Howard County folks in here. We weren't able to do a deep dive into adequate public facility ordinances related to ADUs in Maryland. And this isn't an ordinance, but this is related to schools and I guess just adequate public facilities in general, which extend beyond just parking. So this is from recently approved POCO by design last year. And one of their implementing actions is direct the adequate public facilities ordinance task force to develop recommendations as to the applicability of APFO, the adequate public facilities ordinance, to accessory dwelling unit creation or construction. All right, so this is not an ordinance, but it specifically points out that Howard County is thinking about, do ADUs have the same impact on our adequate public facilities, and do they trigger those tests in the same way? So they still need to talk about this, but they are thinking about it out there. And when we get to the public comment, if anybody Howard County needs to add to that, we can. All right, other state legislation here related to this topic. To summarize this, these are just some examples you'll see that it shall not exceed one parking space per ADU. That means local ordinances shall not. That there should be no additional parking requirements beyond those for the single family dwelling unit on the lot. Some of them do provide for that context sensitivity, 0.5 miles from the transit station. No more than one for lots smaller than 6,000 square feet, no more than two for lots larger than 6,000 square feet. They often address that off-street parking replacement that we saw in the ARP ordinance. If you're going to remove one to develop an ADU, you need to replace it. They prohibit fees in lieu. This is a lot of opinions on fees in lieu. Public street improvements are addressed, and we'll look at some examples of that, but none of these address schools that I can find. So schools, they really delve in on, parking, but when it comes to other facilities like schools, state legislation is not addressing.
You mean an impact fees or other?
Well, they don't say things like you cannot assess, you cannot apply an APFO test to an ADU for schools. They don't delve down into that. And they really, from an enabling perspective or a overriding perspective, they don't really get into that topic. We'll look at quickly look at some examples here, then we'll have some time for discussion and the secretary has to go. So for a lower degree of parking requirement state preemption here, we'll look at New Hampshire. It has enabling language. A municipality may require adequate parking to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit. So that's permitting them, the local jurisdiction, to basically develop their own parking requirements. Moderate degree, looking back at California, parking requirements are generally allowed, but they're prohibited within 1/2 mile of transit station or in a historic district. Right, so they enable to a point, but if it has that context sensitivity we were talking about earlier, if it's close to transit or within a historic district. It also says shall not exceed 1 parking space per accessory dwelling unit or per bedroom, whichever is less. So they do put a max. But it does say you can offer off street or require off street, as long as it doesn't go too far. We haven't looked at Washington yet. I know that because I had to go find their state flag for this one and I hadn't found it before. So that's some state flags. This is a higher degree state preemption on this topic. It's more prohibiting than enabling. Cannot require off-street within 0.5 miles of a transit stop. We saw that in California. Cannot require more than 1 off-street parking spaces on lots smaller than 6,000 square feet, right? And cannot require more than 2 off-street parking spots on lots greater than 6,000 square feet. So while they do permit for off-street, they specifically give numbers based on lot size that they cannot exceed. Real quickly about other facilities. Montana, this is, both of these related to public street improvements. Montana prohibits jurisdictions from requiring public street improvements for ADU approval, as does Washington. Last thing I'll say, and it's probably hard to see this, but will be available in the presentation. These are some public comments related to this topic that we gathered. Our communities were not designed for parking on the street is one. Many incorporated and unincorporated areas in Prince County cannot afford more density for several reasons, among them being parking, infrastructure, code violations. Please allow the required parking discussion to include a way to easily waive that requirement. Mom no longer drives, and they don't require the daughter to construct 2 unnecessary parking spaces. Again, we looked at this earlier, kind of what Newmarket did if people don't need to drive. So that's context sensitive as well. Without reliable public transit, our land is being eaten up by parking requirements, in many cases preventing this type of incremental development. And finally, there needs to be sufficient flexibility in any state policy or legislation ADUs to allow local governments to take into consideration their own unique set of circumstances. And the compiled public comments for the public and for task force are linked there. I also sent it to task force that they're on the website. So these are the questions. I know, Secretary, you only have a few minutes before you have to go.
I will listen to the recording.
Sure. Yeah. So, see what I'm trying to remind myself how much time we have. Really not much time. We can definitely revisit this discussion as part of the closeout thoughts, which we always do. But if anybody has any additional thoughts on preliminary legislative and or policy recommendations or best practices, just the second question related to this. Yes, Jennifer.
I really like the component about transit and being in proximity to transit. And I think, again, it's a defined transit, sometimes in the industry, we'll say transit, we're including bus stops and everything else, but really a rapid transit of some type that's not simply bus stops. But that is one way to help kind of more greatly enforce the whole multimodal network that we really need to be better.
This is just anecdotal, and besides that, I really think it depends on your particular neighbor. Like I live in downtown Westminster myself. In the area that I'm around, generally, I live in a community with 2 churches. So when the churches have events, parking gets crazy.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it does not. So I don't know that in my community, it necessarily makes sense to have a hard parking requirement. Or if we would have a parking requirement, it would be very modest. But I know that my community might be a little bit different than other communities. When we start adding on, parking requirements, we are making it more and more difficult for the ADU to happen. So I think we need to be careful in our recommendations of what we suggest when it comes to parking, is my thought.
And I was just gonna when I say the transit, basically that you do not need to have the parking if you are within the 1/2 mile of transit. And so I just wanted to clarify that because I just said transit. So, okay.
But I meant even outside of that, I don't know that you always necessarily need to require parking if you're not within a transit area. depending upon, again, your community.
Correct.
But that's kind of hard because there might be certain circumstances where I'm sure James might have different feelings.
Right.
regarding
And real piggyback, what I would say, this committee needs to say, allow your local jurisdiction to deal with your parking issue. Because in that way, they'll deal with it, if you will. And I realize that's not what we're trying to do here, but every community is different.
But
He lives in a community with churches and they have events every now and then. I live in a community that has a lot of events. And so parking is a little different for me. Yes, ma'am.
sorry. I just, in reaction to that, I think we've seen that parking has been an instrument for stopping ADU development. So the language to me is less about us saying you have to include parking, but more, what would we say to incentivize communities to not use parking in a, I don't know the right word, difficult manner.
Reasonable. Yeah, let me just make a parting comment and I'll let you all continue and Joe will moderate, but we're living in a different world than we were 10 years ago. Parking standards aren't up to date anymore. And it goes both ways. We have more people working from home that used to leave during the day. So if the nearby something parked on the street, not a problem because people were coming and going. You know, we definitely have different, you know, in some more dense areas, we have more shared economies going on. So we have those kinds of situations. I think for us, I think acknowledgement somewhere that parking's not what it used to be, first of all. And then, you know, really understanding also where the world is going, which is more towards maximum parking requirements versus minimum. And I feel like some of this is heading towards minimum, when in fact, a lot of places are going towards maximums. And so taking advantage of shared parking type opportunities and things like that. And we've got this overset of permeability. I mean, the last thing we want is to decrease our increase our impermeable surfaces. And so a lot happening here, but I think what we have to do is move ourselves beyond some of those old standards to this notion of reasonability. And the fact that I live next to a college. Okay, students park there, you know, some days I'm there, some days I'm not, some of it's permit. Everything's so different, but the notion of creating unreasonable requirements, that's what scares me.
Correct.
If that's going on, if people are being unreasonable for the purposes of creating barriers versus really looking at the whole of the situation. That becomes
Back doorway to stop ADUs.
Exactly,
Under the guise.
and that.
And I think there are areas that are doing that.
Yeah, and so and not for us to judge, but for us to really think about how we create these recommendations. And so I do think ultimately we're going to end up with some sort of a table or chart or something that sort of is based on scale and size. And I would love if anybody wants to help with that diagram, because I think that's where we could probably ultimately use some help, is how do we create a visual? You've seen it in other types of situations where we can do that. But with that, I have to go tackle affordable housing expansion. And now
One last comment, we're gonna get back.
And then I have to leave.
Okay.
you're doing the same thing I'm
Yeah, you're-
which I apologize for. Please continue.
Good luck.
I think that to allow people to put parking restrictions is only to create a barrier. And when I look at my family, when, my kids and I my kids were growing up, we went from a 2-car family to a 4-car family overnight. I sponsor midshipmen. My house, 4-bedroom, I have 1 car. When they're there, I have a whole army of cars. I mean, it is only limiting, right? A navy of cards, a navy of cards. So I think that you are absolutely right, that this is a limiting thing and we need to be very, very cautious about allowing counties or municipalities to limit or to put parking restrictions in a way that says, oh yeah, anybody can have an ADU as long as you have 4 off-street parking spaces. Good luck.
Thank you all.
We will come back to this, so we're gonna keep on schedule primarily, we're gonna have time at the end, but primarily, so make sure we can hit that public comment from 12 to 12:15. Period. So, keep all your thoughts in mind, up to it. We're gonna look back now. Usually we do this earlier, but I had to move around the agenda. So we're gonna look back now at what we talked about last meeting. And the preliminary design and building code recommendations that our topic last meeting. Now the document itself, which is linked on here, it's been linked a couple other places in the presentation, has more than this. This is just kind of a summary of it. But I wanted to point out, like, this is what I gleaned, what we gleaned internally from that discussion. And interested in your thoughts either now or again, when I set up an easier way to comment on these. So everything's kind of locked up. All right. So for local governments, best or recommendations for local governments, which is again, the local government, state government, best practices is the charge from the bill. So regarding this topic, there's a clear recognition that design, accessibility, and safety objectives should be considered in ADU requirements, right? We talked a lot about that last time. We heard from the focus group meeting that met on early in January, but not be so overly restrictive or prescriptive as to hinder construction or unit affordability. There was expressed desire for balance there. We also talked about design requirements being approved ministerially, and that zoning ordinances should be simple. We always come back to this simplicity, this desire for simplicity as much as possible. And again, no more restricted than those for the primary structure. We've seen that throughout as a theme throughout that requirements for the primary structure should remain.
Joe, question about that. I thought that we had talked about, we had a whole discussion about that, you know, an ADU is an accessory structure. So why are we going to have different requirements for ADU over what would be required for another accessory structure? Like, in other words, if I have a garage in my backyard and I have to have certain setbacks, I thought the concept was that the ADU would not have to meet additional requirements over what would be the accessory structure.
Yeah, the difference is between, are we talking about the primary structure or the accessory structure?
Yeah, because the setback requirements are different for accessory rather than primary structure.
But although we heard today about Chevy Chase setback requirements, and I think there's a lot of validity to that because the accessory structures usually have a pretty close relationship to the property lines. And if we're talking about those as dwellings, there is some discussion to be had about potential for fire movement from property to property if they're right next to each other. And accessory units, you're assuming people are not living in those accessory units like a garage or a shed. If somebody's living in it, now you've got a life safety issue. So I think that is potentially, I don't know exactly how that gets.
That's going to make it much more difficult for conversion. Do you know what I mean? If you require different setbacks.
Well,
So this
so
is
you can, in that case, perhaps do a conversion, but you've got to talk about fire rated materials or doing something that makes sure that you're carrying for the life safety aspect of it.
But I think that, and you bring up both of the good points, and I think what you're referencing had a lot more to do with our discussion on lot requirements. Whereas now we're talking about design and maybe, so there's a little distinction there, like, I don't know if many ordinances have a whole heavy-handed design approach to accessory structures, so you probably know more than I do. So I think that might be where the distinction is here.
Yeah, going back to lot requirements. Yeah.
It's not
Okay.
architectural. So zoning ordinance would need lot requirements.
Okay, well, these are all the things I need your feedback on as we continue refining, so that's a good point as well. But, you know, I think this goes back to one of our earliest discussions about whether or not ADUs are considered a residential unit or they're considered an accessory unit. And I think sometimes I've gotten the impression that we want it to be considered a residential unit for everything that brings, but when it comes to specifically the lot requirements, we want it to be considered the same as an accessory use because it allows for more flexibility on the site. But something we'll definitely want to come back to visit as we do that prioritization exercise. Okay, so we talked a lot about not having things so burdensome and complicated that would require the homeowner to hire an architect, even though Deborah, I'm sure would appreciate that. But, you know, that the idea that homeowners aren't developers, they don't have a lot of money or time to do all this, that we don't want to be too restrictive or too burdensome to make them spend that money, because that's kind of, you know, going against the whole purpose of it.
To be fair, zoning is already so burdensome that people
That's
should
true.
hire an architect.
For state governments, we talked about engaging the Maryland Historical Trust, and needing that that balances design and affordability. We talked about encouraging flexibility in state mandates such as sprinkler and accessibility requirements for ADUs. If, you know, I'm not an expert on the sprinkler requirements, but you know, I went back and listened to it. It's like if that sprinkler requirement wouldn't be required for, say, an addition or other modification to the home that does not apply to ADUs, that was a topic, at least something to be examined. Same thing with accessibility requirements. And then it always comes back to tiny home construction. That's the state needs to explore that more in relation. Whether or not we get that done during the tenure of this task force is yet to be determined. But so for best practices, there was a lot of discussion about programmatic or other kinds of support processes for homeowners in relation to this topic. And that, you know, that the fact just like loosening or enabling ADUs in your zoning ordinance might not be enough. That if jurisdictions that want to encourage ADUs must do like what I just said. So a potential practice for ADU building designs, grants or loans, partnerships with nonprofits, other housing organizations. And on and on. We talked a lot about ADU amnesty programs and that, you know, helping people that may have illegal ADUs get right with the jurisdiction upon the adoption of ADU. We have a few minutes to continue addressing these.
Sorry, just one clarification on the tiny home construction. I think that that's related to tiny houses on wheels
You're right.
specifically.
You're right.
Because tiny houses are starting to be incorporated and can kind of follow a more mainstream process, but there is no process for tiny house wheels.
Okay. Any other thoughts on these recommendations? And I might have missed something. There's a lot more in the actual document I sent. This is me trying to encapsulate that fits on a slide. And I will be reaching out to you all again soon with a document that you can put.
Hey, Joe, I have one
Sorry.
question.
Forgot about the front line. Yeah, go ahead, Theo.
No, no big deal. So something that I think we need to reconcile is we both say that the ADU should not be more restrictive than that of the primary structure, and that it shouldn't prescribe building materials or an architectural finishing. But there could be some codes that require certain building materials or architectural finishing for the primary structure. So it could, if we could have something that's not more restrictive than the primary structure, but the primary structure still requires certain, you know, architectural standards. So it's just that there was a possible contradiction there that we just need to come up with a decision on. I think we're saying that if the primary structure requires architectural standards, those same architectural standards are not required for the ADU, and that might get to Mr. Hoff's point about, you know, an accessory standards for an accessory structure architecturally versus standards for a primary structure architecturally.
Theo. Something, yeah, right. That could potential contradiction there and detailing those a little bit more. Provide guidance, and so this contradiction could be avoided or applied to different situations based on what zoning ordinances and other design guidelines already say. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, we can come back to this again after if you like. All right, so I want to thank Susan for doing analysis of the builder developer survey. We didn't get as many responses as we'd like, but I do want to thank everybody who tried to get out there. I want to give a quick overview of some of those responses. I sent you a much longer analysis and summary document Susan from the preparation for this meeting, and it's part of the meeting materials. I'm realizing more and more how much input we actually are going to have for this final report. Some of it will probably be, added to appendices, but there's a lot to sift through. There's a lot of information there. We got a lot more today with the today's panel discussion. For those joining virtually, when I post this presentation, the complete survey results and summary are linked at the bottom, also on the website. So again, keeping in mind the specific audience for the survey was builders, developers. So how would you rate the current demand for ADUs in the regions, communities in which you work? We see a definite skew towards significant demand. Not a single respondent said no demand. Another thing to keep in mind, and I know Fahmi and I have talked about this, is this is going to be, these questions are also contributing to that market analysis component of our charge. What have you found to be the primary reason a property owner might consider an ADU? So this one, you could only pick one response. And some of the ones towards the bottom are ones that other individuals added. You'll see a overwhelming primary purpose is the additional living space for a family member or other friend relation. So strong, I mean, it basically is the only response almost there. You see a couple other ones added. You still see aging in place, aging parent. They wanted to add some more clarity. All right, what are the primary barriers to constructing ADUs? This one was a select all that applies. That's why you can't add up these percentages to equal 100, right, like you could with the last one. So this was just a percentage of people that responded to any of these questions are indicated there. So the primary barriers they mentioned are zoning limitations. We talked a lot about those throughout our tenure here. Permitting process, parking requirements, but it's pretty evenly spaced there. The lower ones being development fees, local or neighborhood opposition. Now, there were some other responses on this that didn't even make the cut. So there were other questions that could have been answered, but these are the ones that rose to the top.
Joe.
I see there's a question. I see this hand. I'm gonna go to Amy real quick. Amy, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I would just like to point out that I read through the survey results. I was really interested in them. And while there is criticism that most jurisdictions do not have regulations, there is an equal number of criticism that the permitting process is cumbersome and should be expedited. So I just want to point out that both of those factors can't be entirely true. If we don't have regulations, then we don't have permitting delays because they're not permitted. So I just
Thank you, Amy.
to call out that discrepancy.
So I thought one thing that's interesting here is if you notice high percentage wise zoning limitations and permitting processes. But if you notice lower, much lower was local or neighborhood opposition. Anecdotally, I just think that our zoning laws are just behind at times. I don't think that, like, for instance, if I was in my neighborhood and said, hey, I'm going to put a ADU in my carriage house, I don't think I'd have a bunch of neighbors freaking out about it. But our zoning laws and permitting won't allow me to do that right now. And so I think that's just interesting. I just make that point that, to me, that is somewhat interesting that there's such a difference between those. And that's suggestive that I don't know that I think the majority of people out there are much more open to the idea of ADUs being in their neighborhood than some people might think. So, yes.
I think that's very interesting as well. I also go back to, this is the builder and developer survey. So to some degree, I would expect that they're more concerned. They're less, they're being hired to do something. They're less concerned of what the neighbors are. And I'm not saying that's not a factual statement, but I think looking at the information coming from this survey, we need to go back and keep in mind, this is builder developer specific. So even some of these, I mean, they're gonna be focused in on, I'm the builder and developer, what do I need to do to build this and develop this?
It's always, I mean, we intentionally targeted this survey to that audience, and of course, they have their own concerns and interests, and that's why we're finding different ways to reach out to different groups. Anybody online? No? Anybody else? One or two more slides, I think. Notes. Okay, so how do ADUs impact neighborhood livability? Again, this was a select all that apply. That's why the percentages add up to what they do. There's a strong skew towards the positive impacts of neighborhood livability here, such as aging in place, increased housing values, and affordability. Some of those were brought up during our panel discussion today, but probably some more of the potential negative impacts as well. And keep in mind the audience for the survey. So this is the last slide. Again, there's a lot more information in the survey results. It's like a 9-10 page document, but I brought out the biggest one that I thought for today's discussion. So we have a good amount of time before the public comment. So if anybody would like to share more insight and thoughts on either the survey responses, or we can even harken back to what we talked right about before this, which was the previous recommendations. I'm happy to jump between both. Oh, yeah, yes, sure.
I don't know if you're using just stock photos or what, but I think it's important to point out that the survey results indicate that the big driver is to help provide housing for older people. It has to take into consideration that older people or people that have some limited mobility and or disabilities. And ADUs that have stairs are not going to be practical for people of limited mobility. And a lot of the stuff I'm seeing, almost everything I'm seeing, doesn't take that into consideration. The fact that somebody needs a wheelchair, somebody needs assistance with anything. The design has to accommodate that. Most of the designs that I'm talking about here so far are ones that don't people with limited mobility.
Yeah, thank you. Specific to the pictures, I go to what's Creative Commons available for images, so I don't have to cite them as much. So yeah, you're right, that one doesn't align necessarily. Probably not a good alignment of picture and responses there, but yeah.
So in response to that, I do think it's important, especially when you're talking about, if you had a ground level garage, it's important that, those considerations be made to that you're providing a unit in the long term that could be accessible. But I at the same time, I think as a task force, we do not want to discourage, like for instance, if I have an old carriage house like that's represented in that picture, and you have above, you're on the second floor, we still need housing. You know what I mean? It's not just, older people that we're trying to provide housing for. So, I think we don't want to limit things, because the more we limit, we want as much diversity as we can get, or as much additional stock as we can get within reason. So I think we need to be careful about, again, going back to, if every unit needs to be sprinklered, if every unit, all we're doing is driving up the cost and making it less likely that it will actually happen.
And I would say, one thing I forgot to respond to, there's more about accessibility, and I'd say in design and relation and aging in relation to design in the full document of recommendations. But you're right. But also your point as well, Dan, like was that balance between the two that I extracted from our discussion last time, that they both need to be considered, and some lots or some designs are better suited to supporting those individuals with disabilities or aging population, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on that because we discussed that in the focus group in January, the design focus group in January. Specifically when talking about ADUs that might be commercially rented and or in some scale where ADA requirements come into play in private, settings, they don't come into play. They come into play only in kind of personal need. If you want to add it, you could, but if there was a way for us to, I think going to Councilman Hoff's point, it's probably not our area that we should be kind of getting into. It's more diving into the weeds, but just so that we did, in our focus group, we did try to tackle that discussion and make it known that we're, most houses are already difficult for people with disabilities. That's already an issue.
Yes.
I mean, maybe what the discussion should be incentives for people providing ADUs that have accessibility, that are going to be commercially used or, helping. I mean, what we're finding with the task force, I feel like ADUs are expensive, they're burdensome, there are a lot of requirements. And if our goal is to address the housing shortage and ADU is one way of doing that, how do we help create them or make the path easier for them to be done? And is that incentives? Is that, tax breaks?
So just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that I'm opposed to, making more flexible ADU policy. But I don't think saying that these are for granny flats, it should be used as the reason why it's being done. Because it isn't.
Any other thoughts? Any online? But we have still more time to continue this discussion. I wanted to give you all a quick update on some recent housing reform legal challenges. We got about 5 minutes. Perfect.
There's a better in that.
It's fuzzy, but yes, it's better, I guess. All right, so I just want to give you some updates. I wanted to point these out because, we're talking a lot about local or state legislation. We use examples. Just because it passed does not guarantee that ADU strategies or ordinances will be implemented for various different reasons. We talked earlier just about capacity at the local level to implement something or to enforce something. But here's some legal challenges that I want to bring to your attention. There's links to news articles on all of these if you want a little bit more. Earlier, we saw an example of some of that study that was done by the Urban Institute for Alexandria when they were developing theirs. So in November, Alexandria adopted a bill as part of its, what they called its zoning for housing plan. And this was more of a eliminate single family zoning type ordinance, right? That might have some overlap with an ADU ordinance, but they're not the same thing per se. But lots of times they have the same level of opposition for same reasons of opposition, but also same desired outcome. They described it as a set of zoning changes that will make it easier to put townhouses and small apartment buildings in neighborhoods that have long been reserved for one house with a yard on each lot. Right, and then on January 17th of 2024, there was a lawsuit filed against this that argued that the Northern Virginia city violated its charter as well as the Virginia Constitution by loosening zoning rules last year for its more suburban residential areas by failing to adequately show how those changes impact the real estate market or the city's infrastructure. Right, so that's the challenge. I don't know where it's so fresh. Obviously, I don't know where it is, but it's related to today's topic. The lawsuit also charges that no studies were conducted to examine how increased density might affect traffic, schools, first responders, or sewer pipes in violation of the Alexandria City Charter and the city's comprehensive plan. The next one I want to point out is Minneapolis. Anybody who's been following this for years that knows the Minneapolis kind of famous for being the first major city that I'm aware of to try to abolish single family zoning. They did this a few years ago. By many, it was considered a model to be either considered or emulated or hated, I guess, by some. But they were, you know, it was big news in the planning industry when Minneapolis did this. But a judge recently blocked their implementation of that plan. So this thing that a lot of people were looking to, you know, is now tied up in court. This is the last one I want to point out is Montana, because we've looked at Montana's state legislation a number of times. And, you know, I was always kind of surprised how like aggressive Montana was. You wouldn't think of Montana having that aggressive legislation, but they were. So a group, I think this is a very interesting name of this group, has filed a lawsuit. They're called Montanans Against Irresponsible Densification is the name of this group. And they have a lawsuit that argues that the state cannot override covenants. This is very specific to the covenant overrides that were put into that state legislation. So the 12/15/2023 complaint states that homeowners in Montana have traditionally relied on single-family zoning designations to protect the scale, character, and financial viability of their most important investment. And then right before the New Year's, on December 29th, Montana judge put the bill on hold, along with another pro-housing bill while the legislation plays out. The bill was supposed to take effect on the 1st of this year, so it's now on hold while that lawsuit plays out. So I just want to bring those to your attention to know that this, you know, these are complicated and there's a lot of opposition and there's a lot of legal challenges. Adam Snyder will be back with us in March, and he's gonna summarize his research on covenants and covenant overrides and restrictions in America. So I just want to bring that up. We are now open for public comment. As always, we're going to start with the people in the room if they would like to say anything. And then if you are online and would like to submit a comment, please put it in the chat. And my colleague, Susan LaRouche, will be monitoring that and we will read that comment out. So we do have some members of the public. No, you're not forced to speak, but if you would like to, we'd be happy to hear from you. Anybody from Howard County want to talk about that Cocoa by Design thing I brought up? You don't have to either, but I'll put you on the spot. You've been here every meeting.
Task force is coming up. It's really more focused on the schools, because most of you probably know Howard County schools are very contentious, and so
Yeah.
how it plays into housing allocation is really.
I think there's just generally discussions revolve around how much these ADUs actually contribute to the schools. There's sort of the argument that those many look at ADUs and see that it doesn't really contribute to a lot of student generation, but at the same time, there's arguments on the other side that say, Howard County is a contractor for schools, and that might. But it's just kind of balancing that and trying to look to see how that actually works out.
Yeah, so like I'm sure the state legislation related to ADUs doesn't generally address the school impacts. A lot of it's on parking, other community facilities, but not so much the schools. So it's an unexplored area. And we're not going to be able to delve into all the APFOs in Maryland to see how directly they connect between ADUs and the actual tests that they do. But it's something to keep in mind. And Howard County, thank you for exploring it, because you might be able to inform the rest of us. There was one comment, Susan, you said that somebody gave us the case number from Montana.
Yeah, thanks to Amy for giving us the Montana case. Number BV-23-1248C for anyone who's interested in looking that up.
Any of the lawyers in the room?
Can you read that? D as in dog, B as in Victor, -23-1248, C as in cat. Thank you. Yep. Okay, Amy Bordoff has her hand up.
Oh, Amy, yes.
I have a copy of that decision. Our land use attorney forwarded it to me a week or so ago, and it is interesting. So I can forward that out to the group if anyone's interested.
Which one? The Montana?
Yes.
I mean, the decision to put it on hold, right? It's not, there hasn't been a final decision as far as I know, but has there been?
I thought I was reading a final decision. I'll send it out to you.
Okay, yeah, we'd like to look at that. I mean, it's important to note, and we've seen it here, that we're obviously not the only state that's dealing with the housing crisis. We're not the only state that's really trying to tackle this from a legislative perspective, from an educational perspective, from a resource perspective. We're all we should learn from each other. We're all kind of going through the same challenges at both the local level and the state level. And it's very poignant. Theo can speak to this probably better than anybody else here. The HCD has a very ambitious housing legislative package working its way through the General Assembly this year. And while it doesn't address ADUs specifically, a lot of the same concerns, a lot of the same difficulties that we have to navigate apply to those as well. Especially if you look at the examples, Alexandria and Minneapolis, which is more of elimination of single family zoning and specifically to ADUs. Is there any other chat?
We do. We have a public, Corinne Keating has her hand raised. How do we get?
I'm not sure. We have to unmute. There you go. She looks like unmuted. Go ahead, Karen.
Hi, thank you for unmuting me. I'm Karen Keating. I'm a real estate agent in in Maryland, but I have a property owner with a house in Prince George's where originally when the house was built in 1949, they had a garage in the very back of the property, which they built and lived in while they built the house. And so as a result, it's been mostly an unoccupied ADU since 1949 until fairly recently when they put a family member in there. But at the time that it was not built according to any of the rules and guidelines that you all have been talking about today. Like it's 2 feet away from the property line and on the side. And I just don't know how the new rules would restrict and regulate this property owner from using this as a legal ADU in the future.
Yeah, well, you're bringing up a good point that we've discussed in the past. It kind of goes back to this idea of amnesty programs. We were looking at design last time that there's an understanding out there that there are a lot of ADUs constructed before any ADU ordinances. You know, this is not a new thing to build accessory places for people to live on their property. And we don't have, none of us would have an answer specific to the Prince George's example you're giving here. But, you know, when you have units like that, a homeowner, property owner would be interested in being able to make legal and be an official ADU that's that meets all the permitting requirements. There may be amnesty programs that allow for some, either complete work to get it to the current requirements in a newly developed ordinance or partial work to ensure proper building code and other safety measures are met. So that is one possibility. I can't speak for Prince George's whether or not they have any program like that or what their intent would be. Yes, James.
Real quickly, what we do in the town of Brentwood is if you own a home and you want to turn it into a rental ADU type, you then have to bring your home up to code for obvious reasons. And it's renewed annually. So a code inspector is going to come in and make sure you meet whatever the requirements are. So if that is what you want to do or what have you, someone is going to have to make sure that it meets a standard. If not, that may not be the best option for you, so to speak. Because you then take that person who lives their life in their hands and they want to sue somebody if something does happen.
Yes, public comment. Yes.
It's Marie Dias, Real Estate Academy, education provider, also real estate broker. In terms of affordability, can a manufactured home be considered as an ADU?
It depends on what the local ordinance says, yes, but it could be, absolutely.
It should be able to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. There's legislation about manufactured homes now working its way through the General Assembly. They're not specific to ADUs. But I think that gets back to some of the comments we had, or the recommendations coming out of the last meeting was that the, architectural, like the construction building materials of ADUs should not be so prescribed as to prevent something like that, or to make a homeowner have to spend money on an architect, because then it makes the ADU not affordable for the homeowner or the renter.
Two more online comments.
Yeah. Do they want
Eilina Schinder,
hand raised? All right, we
hand
got-
raised.
we have two comments online. These will be the last two before we keep going. Go ahead.
Hello,
Alina?
can you hear me? I am Ileana Schinder. I'm an architect in Washington, DC, and I actually specialize in additional dwelling units. In fact, I wrote a book on the topic 2 years ago. So I'm following very closely the impact that code changes have in the region. I've built a lot of these ADUs in Montgomery County, DC, and a little few in Virginia. And I've encountered a lot of barriers and a lot of miswritten rules, well-intentioned but miswritten. So I'm very glad to hear the level of discussion I've heard in this. I hope that we can follow up later. But the main thing I wanna bring up is that when you discuss rules, make sure that there is no confusion between zoning and building rules. I've heard a lot about, for example, energy consumption, water consumption, and waste. Those things are normally a building requirement, same as fire protection and distances from other buildings. So when you discuss zoning, which is I think that we should focus on, is the relationship of the building with its neighbors and not the safety or health requirements outlined by the International Building Code, that is a state of Maryland requirement. So, and also when we talk about, for example, water consumptions, new buildings tend to have about 30% of the consumption of water and waste reduction, just simply because of, again, building code requirements outlined by the state of Maryland. This is a super long discussion, so I really hope I can participate in future meetings. I'm not sure I should be, I didn't want to butt in going to Baltimore, but I really look forward to seeing how this discussion evolves. I've encountered a lot of these issues you're discussing already on practical terms, like parking, again, water, privacy and security of neighbors, setbacks, that kind of stuff. So I'm really hoping to participate in the future. Feel free to reach out to me. I've done quite a bit of research as well, and I love how you point out per state. But the most important thing is like each decision that you outline will keep people away from implementing it. So particularly if it has to do with taste, technology, energy, sustainability, parking. So as much as we want to organize how the city is laid out, the more rules that are implemented, the least we're gonna get. So just I want to encourage you to tread carefully when you plan to impose rules that have nothing to do with quality of life and has to do all with like current moment. For example, when you call about how many people or what relationship the people living in the building should have, it's very hard in today's life to define what is a family. It is very hard to say, okay, who is allowed to live with someone else? So beware, tread carefully there because it has nothing to do with architecture, urban design, or even schools. So anyways, I look forward to participating in future ones. And that was my comment. And anyways, I hope to reach out to some of you with like opinions or help or questions that I may have.
Thank you, Eilina. Absolutely. We will have your information now. We'll reach out to you. Okay, we have one more last public comment of Brenda Jefferson. You should be unmuted now, or almost. Can you click on this? Here we go. You're unmuted now, Brenda. Brenda? Should be unmuted.
She's unmuted from us.
Well, we unmuted you. Make sure you're unmuted yourself. You're muted again.
She's muted.
Unmute yourself, Brenda. Okay. All right, you look good now. Try one more time. Unmuted. I'm sorry, Brenda, we're not hearing you right now. If you could, we may be able to check back later. We need to continue with the agenda, or you can submit your comments in the chat. Sorry about the technical difficulties. Okay. All right, so before we get to, we're gonna take about 10 minutes. The task force, as we normally do, is our closing round. We're gonna go around, hear from everybody. It's your summary and final thoughts, particularly if you can focus ideally on today's topic, which is parking and community facilities. We have other thoughts, we'll take those as well. But I want to save the last 5 minutes to go over next steps, what comes next, and a couple, 1 or 2 favors to ask of you all. So we're gonna start with those in the room. I'm just gonna go around this way and then we'll get to those online. Izzy?
I agree with Secretary Flores on the approach that we should take. Talking about flexibility. And also understanding that we're talking about really kind of a narrow part of a much broader housing agenda by the state. And that there are, I think, limited applications in the state where it makes sense, where it's reasonable to develop and support ADUs. And maybe in other parts, it's just not an option.
I think we've said enough. I just want to thank Mr. Platt for coming out and representing the inner cities and towns inside the Beltway and Prince George's County and Montgomery County areas. He said a lot, and I will just leave it at that.
I'm looking forward to when we get to the April meeting, even though it might be a long meeting, to kind of really dive back through, because we've had so many discussions, we have all these draft recommendations, but really kind of going through it and making good recommendations. Because at the end of the day, we are not setting policy. We are just going to be making recommendations that hopefully somebody does something with, and it doesn't just sit on a shelf. As to parking, you know, again, I think we need to keep in mind the more complicated we make this with our recommendations, the less likely it is to be implemented or lead to good results. So I think, you know, as with all our discussions, I think we do need to keep in the broader context, but we always need to go back to, are we going to make this too complicated? And that is just not going to happen. So.
I echo those thoughts as well. I wanted to just reiterate what I had said earlier again of just ensuring that we are very specific and intentional as we put this document together to define what we mean by ADU, what it is not. And that also goes to our glossary of terms, which I keep writing them down. I know I need to go into the document and input them. And another great point was brought up of just helping define for all users, you know, the building code versus, you know, the design versus zoning. I echo the enforcement. I'm looking forward to seeing it all together. You know, how are we enforcing this? What are we putting together? Is it enforceable in some component, where that falls? And also, as we put it all together, is this still something that is affordable and accessible for somebody to do as we bring all those recommendations together? Specific to the parking, I do feel strongly about, you know, we want to keep it flexible. Absolutely. Our parking requirements are outdated, but our technology is moving faster than we could update them, even if we were on top of our parking requirements. I do believe in having that transit, and I speak to that very much of we have to be more than car centric in the state and in the country, and having that transit component as one of the recommendations really does push that multimodal network and multimodal mobility. The last 2 things I wanted to touch on, again, I come back to them. The resale opportunity is, once we put all these recommendations together, what happens when? Next steps, how does that happen? Once this house is on the market, what goes with that? And I know we keep talking about it a little bit, but I think April's a great time to pull that back together. And the very last item, I don't know why I didn't think of this sooner, but as we keep hitting all of these states with recommendations and that research, and I know everyone's been doing a phenomenal job going out there and getting them, we've talked about this as an issue in Maryland of we need people to stay here. So I'd be really interested and I'm happy to volunteer to help out, but Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, and we've used a couple examples from Virginia, but I work in northern Baltimore County and I probably at this point in time, 60% of my colleagues in that office are living in Pennsylvania because of affordability. So I think it's really critical that if we come back to the heart of this, this is one component of this overarching issue, overarching concern of losing people, that we should be looking to our states immediately adjacent to us that would be viable locations people move and still possibly work in Maryland or move to still maintain their familial connections. And what are they doing so that we can see, are they making it easier or harder? And how do we embrace that as well?
Andy?
I really don't have a lot to add. I think it's already been covered. The one thing I'll say, Joe, you had sent out a webinar, ADU strategy for increasing housing supply in the middle neighborhood. I thought it was fantastic. And if you guys haven't looked into it, I think you should check it out. That's all I have.
Definitely. I'm halfway through it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add either, except well, just to reiterate what Jennifer just reiterated, what this lady, Ileana, I think her name was, pointed out that we are not here talking about code requirements. Code requirements are covered by code requirements. The building will be what the building is based on what all that means and all that is. And if I'm incorrect about that, then we can talk about it, but we're here to talk about the zoning implications. So when we're kind of muddying the pot, I think, in a lot of these discussions, and that makes it a little bit harder to, I think, judge accurately.
Thank you. We have some aspect of that in our design recommendations about letting building code, at least, maybe it was unit size, let building code govern this, the minimum unit size, but maybe we can put more direct language in there about building code.
Yeah, be really clear on what is the building code, which of the elements that we're talking about fall into the building code pot and which of the elements fall into the zoning pot. And then if something that falls into the building code pot does need to be addressed, then we can, but at least we know we're addressing something in this pot over here, not this one.
Yep. Thank you. All right, we'll move to those online. I'm just gonna go around and what I see. I'll start off with Amy Mordock.
Again, I think that a lot of the comments that have already been shared are we need to revisiting our focus because with this topic, it's so easy to go broader and talk about things that we can't control, like the building codes. I think the only side comment, which I'm going to be guilty of doing what I just kind of pointed out, is I'm closely following the governor's affordable housing package. And I think a point that I want to reiterate as a local jurisdiction is that there's a lot that we can control through zoning, and there are a lot of incentives that we can definitely address through local zoning. I think putting all of our eggs in a zoning basket as the be all and end all of addressing a housing crisis is not going to be productive because there are aspects of adequate public facilities that each jurisdiction has to bring to the table that really do have to be considered. And if there are accommodations that can be made, a la looking at reducing parking restrictions, making sure that ADUs are permissible. I think that's one of the biggest ticket items that I learned in participating with this task force. I presumed every jurisdiction allowed ADUs. So that's been an educational point for me. I've worked in jurisdictions where ADUs have been permitted. So making sure that flexibility is in place, but trying to draft or make suggestions, regulatory suggestions without contemplation of the other pots, which would be building code, but also water, sewer, roads, and other infrastructure. That's just going to set local governments up for failure, where a lot of the criticism that is misplaced is going to be driven further into the ground.
Theo, you're next.
Thanks, Joe. So with regards to our recommendations, and specifically parking, I really like the models that limit the ability of jurisdictions to require parking in areas that are within a half-mile transit. I think that's very much in line with the administration's priorities, both specifically within the Housing Expansion and Affordability Act and more broadly what MDOT is doing to incentivize TOD. I think trying to require parking within an area of a half mile of major transit stop really kind of goes against what everyone across government is trying to do. I also think that requiring or allowing jurisdictions to require 2 parking spots or more for an ADU is paramount to making ADUs illegal in that jurisdiction. So ensuring that at the very least, any type of state recommendations prohibit or recommend that they prohibit parking of more than 1 parking space per ADU is very important. Lastly, with regards to public facilities, we didn't, the panelists, and thank you for the panelists if you're still there. It was a fantastic discussion. One of the panelists or a couple of panelists discussed septic, which is an issue all in and of itself, but we didn't really touch on public water and sewer. And I think requiring an ADU builder to have a separate connection for water and sewer is can be prohibitive and can be very expensive. So ensuring that our recommendations state that, granted, if the task force agrees with me, that there should be no requirement for a separate connection for the ADU, and instead allowing the water and sewer line to run directly from the primary structure would reduce the cost of constructing the ADU. And provided there is capacity, in most homes I would imagine there is capacity for the more limited water and sewer that's coming out of an ADU. And that is it for my closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. And we'll talk more about water and sewer definitely in the March meeting. Priscilla, I know you're driving. I'm not sure if you're trying to share or just listening. But welcome to share. Oh, don't be safe, be safe. Oh my God. All right, we'll come back to Priscilla. Next is Quinn, and then Lori, and then we'll come back to Priscilla, and then I have some closing things. Go ahead, Quinn.
No, I don't want to share. I'm going to be parking in a minute.
Okay, no problem. Good luck at the General Assembly. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, and I really have nothing further to add, Joe. I just want to thank those panelists that were able to attend today. It was very informative. So thank you.
Thank you, Quinn. And Lori, that means you have the last word.
Thank you. So I agree with the task members that we do need to make sure that there is some flexibility with respect to the parking, because it can be prohibitive. And again, to go back to, I think it was 2 meetings ago, where Annapolis spent a lot of time on the parking, and that ended up not being a barrier, which I was still amazed at. So I think we need to ensure that there is some flexibility. I'd also like to expand on the conversation, the zoning versus the building code. And I agree with Amy, they are separate, but I do think there could be a way that we could provide some recommendations, because that is going to be something that could, as different jurisdictions are adopting the code after the state adopts it, it is going to be something that we're going to have to tackle. So I would like to see maybe a conversation more about that and how that could work, or how it should work. Or I think we could also think about maybe best practices from the building code perspective, and that could help the jurisdictions with either adopting or implementing the code. And I agree. I think the septic conversation, I'm looking forward to hearing about that, because I think that's going to be a significant issue that I know that we will have to address here in Prince George's County. So I'm looking forward to that discussion. And like I said, I agree with everyone else's comments. So those are my minor comments.
All right, well, I appreciate everybody from the task force participating today. There we go. All right, so next steps, sorry, we're already at 12:40 right now, we'll be quick. So I still need to form that housing organizations focus group in March. If you have any recommendations, email me. I'm happy to do the cold call to them if you just give me the name of the organization or connect me to them. We'll have to figure out a time that works, so probably more like mid-March since we're getting closer to April now. The environmental organization survey, I sent you, not the most nicely formatted Google form survey questions to you. If you have any questions, if you have any feedback on those questions or thoughts, suggestions, please get them to me by the end of February, because we will be distributing that in early March for final, we'll look at the survey results at the April meeting. So now's your chance. If you have any questions on the environmental organizations or any suggestions for that draft survey, I need to thank David Dahlstrom, my colleague who's on the screen, for drafting that survey. And then once we distribute it, we'll also be asking for help distributing it. We're continuing to work on the housing market analysis. I know Fami and I are having internal meetings. We have some internal deadlines. We're gonna have something to share with you in April. The glossary of terms, and Jennifer mentioned it, I failed to update any terms between last meeting and this one, so I need to get back to it too. I'm not the only one, but I do appreciate it, especially because we talked a lot about building code versus zoning today. So if there are any things that you want to add, there's definitely others in this group that are far more expert on the building code than me. So if there's anything you want to make sure we add to that glossary, please add it. Continuing to craft the legislative and policy recommendations. And then our next meeting is here, March 19th, the third Tuesday of March, same time, MDP office, unless there's a snowstorm or something, 9:30 to 12:30. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Adjourned.